The Vatican's biggest fear wasn't war or rebellion, but an ancient Bible that was older than Rome itself, full of mystery and forbidden writings. It came from the highlands of Ethiopia, bringing stories the church had hidden and truths it couldn't control. Inside its pages were gospels that the Western world had gotten rid of, names the Vatican refused to accept. It's a piece of history carved in stone, never changed by church councils. These aren't just old stories, they're real papers kept safe in secret rooms where mysteries still live. Tonight, we're diving into the hidden parts of history. If these kinds of secrets get you thinking, make sure to hit that subscribe button. So get comfy, close your eyes, and let the story begin. It showed up without any warning, no big fuss or announcements, covered in thick cloth and sealed with wax. The box had no label, except for a faded line of writing, barely visible through the dust. Inside was a book that shouldn't have lasted, not because it was fake, but because it was real, dangerously real. And this realness went against the history the Vatican had carefully built. The person who found it was a Jesuit scholar named Father Luca. He was quiet and careful, known for his work in saving holy writings. He had spent most of his life in the cold study rooms under the Apostolic Palace, putting old papers in order, and yet nothing had prepared him for this discovery. The old paper inside the box was ancient, but it was almost perfectly preserved. The cover was strange, made of a material he couldn't figure out, but it was the writing that bothered him first. Ge'ez, the old language of Ethiopia, understood by only a few smart people today. As he looked at the content, his fingers started to shake. The first surprise was how the texts were arranged. Genesis was there, but it wasn't the beginning. Another story came before it, the Book of Enoch, a book the Vatican had ignored for many years. It talked about angels coming down from heaven, forbidden relationships, watchers who showed humans knowledge not meant for people. Father Luca had seen mentions of it before, scattered in the margins and in questionable records, but he had never seen it all, not in its current form. And then came the second surprise. Not just different cultures, but the same stories. The question wasn't if the guardians were real anymore, but why this story had been taken out and who decided it was too dangerous to stay in the main collection. In Ethiopia, they never took it out. The guardians are still talked about. Enoch is still honoured. Their holy places still openly show his visions during long, bright church services. But in Rome, the name Enoch is still a quiet warning, a figure too old, too bold, and too full of memories. His book talks about a time before time, a fall before the fall, and a truth the Vatican might still try to change. Not because it's wrong, but because it never stopped being right. In the huge hallways of the Vatican, where history is kept behind locked doors and silence, there's a story almost no one talks about. Not because it was rejected, but because it was never meant to be remembered by the West. It didn't start in Rome, but in Jerusalem, during King Solomon's time. Solomon, a descendant of David who built the first temple, known for his wisdom and wealth. The Bible tells us he ruled Israel peacefully. But in the highlands of Ethiopia, a different story is told, one that lives on in the pages of a book the Vatican has always kept at arm's length. According to the Kebra Nagast, a sacred Ethiopian manuscript older than most Western historians will admit, the Queen of Sheba went to meet Solomon, not just out of curiosity, but because God wanted it. She left not just with treasures and wisdom, but with a son. That child, Menelik, would become the first emperor of Ethiopia. And according to Ethiopian tradition, he took something else, a mystery the Roman Church still refuses to acknowledge. He took Solomon's family line. This simple statement changes everything. If it were true, it would mean that Ethiopia, not Europe, has the most direct royal descendants of David's house. And it would mean that the divine right to rule, which medieval European kings thought they got through their families, might have already belonged to another nation, far from their palaces and cathedrals. The secret came out in the 13th century when Ethiopian priests brought copies of the Kebra Nagast to Jerusalem. According to letters kept deep in the Vatican's archives, a Franciscan monk wrote about seeing the scrolls and immediately wrote to his bosses in Rome. In a part that survived, he wrote that they claim Solomon's throne was never empty, just moved, and that the church is in the wrong place. This was more than just a political problem, it was about religion. If the emperors of Ethiopia really came from Solomon, then they had both royal and religious power. They were kings by birth and guardians by God's will. This put them above any crown in Europe, maybe even above the Pope himself. Some in the Vatican dismissed the claim as a folk tale. Others weren't so sure. A sealed document from 1915, written by a Jesuit missionary, described a ceremony in the Ethiopian royal palace involving a scroll wrapped in golden cloth. The missionary had been told it was part of the original blessing passed down from Solomon to Menelik. He was never allowed to see what was written on it. 5 years later, that same missionary returned to Rome and left the order. Today, the Vatican rarely talks about Solomon's family line, but in Ethiopian churches, it's still deeply honoured. This family line is remembered not through royal titles or symbols, but through hymns, holy songs, and stories carved in old stone. And maybe this is what bothers the Vatican the most. That far beyond Rome, inside churches carved into mountains, an unbroken line continues to exist, wild and untouched by Western history changing. This isn't just a manuscript, it's a challenge. A quiet storm hidden between the old paper and deep belief. The Kebra Nagast, which means the glory of the kings, has been on the edges of Western history books for centuries. In Ethiopia, it's holy writing. Inside the Vatican walls, it's looked at with suspicion, not because it's fake, but because it tells a story the church has never controlled. Written in the old Ge'ez language and passed down through generations of Ethiopian priests, the Kebra Nagast claims something the Roman Church has never publicly said, that Ethiopia, not European lands, holds the true royal descendants of ancient Israel, that the Ark of the Covenant, once humanity's holiest object, was taken from Solomon's temple and brought to Aksum, not by robbers, but by its rightful heir. This claim isn't new. It has echoed in Ethiopian holy places since the early centuries. But when the Vatican first got a Latin translation of the Kebra Nagast in the early 18th century, it caused a quiet stir within the Vatican rooms. The translation had been ordered by a Jesuit named Pedro Paez, who had spent years among Ethiopian thinkers. His efforts were met with silence when he returned. No praise, no criticism, just silence. Because after looking at the manuscript, that silence starts to make sense. The Kebra Nagast tells of Solomon's meeting with the Queen of Sheba, but it goes further. It gives her a presence full of smarts and authority. It tells of her vision where the child left Israel and took root in her body. It talks about her descendant, Menelik, conceived not in sin, but for a divine purpose. And, even bolder, it reveals that Menelik returned to Jerusalem, was welcomed by the priests, and left with the ark itself, not by force, but with heavenly approval. For the Vatican, this was a dangerous idea. It moved the centre of holy stories away from Rome, away from European lands, and onto African soil. It gave Ethiopia not just a holy treasure, but the spiritual right that came with it. In a secret letter from 1906, a Vatican advisor warned the Pope that spreading the Kebra Nagast could encourage a view of Christian history that didn't need Rome. That letter was put in the secret archive and stayed hidden for 70 years. But the unexpected thing that happened didn't come from the manuscript itself, but from what it caused. When Emperor Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia in the 20th century, he was seen not just as a ruler, but as a living link to Solomon. And for countless people worldwide, including in the Caribbean and the Americas, he became a symbol of sacred kingship, a figure whose right to rule came not from military power, but from an ancient agreement. The Vatican never openly talked about the Cabra Nagast, but in the lower rooms of the Apostolic Archive, one of the few copies kept has a handwritten note. In the margin it reads, "If this is true, the Ark didn't disappear. It was never our job to protect it." The Cabra Nagast was never banned by the Vatican, but it was never accepted either. It held a strange place, never officially condemned, but never looked at closely. It wasn't kept in chains, just in silence. And that silence was the most telling part of all. To understand why this manuscript was hidden for centuries, you have to understand what it did to the story the Church had spent so much time building. The Cabra Nagast didn't just suggest a different way to understand Christian stories. It suggested a rival, a complete living legacy that had never gone through Rome, never bowed to its meetings, and never asked for its permission. Inside the Vatican, stories were always carved in layers of Latin and laws, church laws, religious laws, holy laws. It moved forward through popes and meetings, through big churches and courts. But the Cabra Nagast came from a separate kingdom, a kingdom where holy things were kept not behind shiny stones, but inside caves sung in devotion, protected by monks who couldn't read Latin and wouldn't kneel to the Pope's power. When the Jesuits first found the manuscript in the 17th century, they wrote home with a mix of wonder and worry. One person called it a reflection of the Old Testament with its own special identity. Another, more careful, called it dangerously independent. The phrase meant it existed on its own, beyond the Vatican's rule. That was the real threat. The manuscript had been copied by hand for generations. It wasn't mass-produced. It wasn't published in European lands. And yet it had lasted. Its very lasting represented a quiet challenge, a whisper in the shadows, saying, Rome isn't the only keeper of the truth. By the time the Latin translation reached the Vatican, it was treated as a curiosity, not a matter of religious belief. Officially, the Church never reacted, but unofficially, thinkers were warned not to mention it. It wasn't to be taught in religious schools, not to be mentioned in letters, and most importantly, not to be compared to the official Western Bible texts. But silence can't erase a story, and the more quietly it was buried, the more power it seemed to have. In the early 20th century, a professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University started teaching from the Cabra Nagast. Within 12 months, his presentations were stopped, his papers taken, and his name removed from later records. No reason was given, just a transfer to a lower position in rural areas. Years later, he wrote in a secret letter, "The manuscript is dangerous only to those who fear history." This is what the Vatican feared most. Not that the Cabra Nagast was wrong, but that it was right, that it described a holy family line never broken, that it placed the Ark of the Covenant in the care of another people, that it presented a story without Rome. And so the manuscript was never burned, never openly argued against. It was just quietly buried among the shelves, still existing, still waiting. The letter was never meant to be found. It had no official seal, no letterhead, and no recorded date. Yet it showed the unmistakable handwriting of a pope, and the faint smell of old parchment still clung to its edges. It was found in 1972 by a young archivist named Matteo, deep inside a compartment that hadn't been opened in many decades. The writing was faded, but the message remained. The letter began with a quiet urgency. There's a story unfolding in the highlands of Ethiopia. It brings with it identities we've removed and a truth we've chosen not to claim. If we don't respond quickly, we'll no longer be able to ignore it. The signature at the end, though partly faded, matched known examples of Pope Pius V's handwriting. He had been Pope from 1922 until his death in 1939, a time when the Church existed between old powers and new ones, caught in the uncertain silence between conflicts. It was also a time when the Vatican's focus on Africa had grown quickly and on purpose. What worried the Pope, as the letter makes clear, wasn't military or government instability. It was the growing influence of the Kebra Nagast and its bold claim that Ethiopia held the true descendants of Solomon. Even more troubling, from the Vatican's point of view, was the belief that Ethiopia had kept the Ark of the Covenant hidden in plain sight. The letter showed fear, not fear of attack, but of a challenge to Rome's moral right. If this belief spreads, the Pope wrote, it will destroy the basis of our claim to universal truth. We will no longer be able to claim to be the first or the only ones. This was the situation. The Vatican couldn't openly deny the Kebra Nagast without drawing attention to it. But it also couldn't accept it without tearing down centuries of carefully protected stories. And so the Pope gave quiet instructions to put off new publications of the manuscript in European languages, to advise missionaries to avoid openly looking into Solomon's family line, and most of all, to watch for any attempts to bring Ethiopian religious ideas into official church meetings. It wasn't a rule written in anger, but with caution, as if the Pope sensed that too much light might give life to the shadows. The unexpected event happened many years later. Matteo, the archivist who found the letter, died under strange circumstances. He was young, strong, and had no known illness. He collapsed one morning outside the Vatican library, clutching a container of handwritten documents. The container disappeared. The letter was quietly put back in the compartment, and the compartment was sealed again. Even today, the Church has never admitted such a letter exists. But within the rooms of the Apostolic Archive, it's whispered that even a pope once felt fear. The story kept in the pages of a manuscript Rome never wrote, and that fear still remains, subtle as the glow of a flame. In 1624, a small group of Jesuit priests left Rome with the Pope's approval. Their goal was simple, at least officially: to strengthen ties with the Ethiopian Church and gently guide it towards full unity with the Vatican. But underneath, the real goal was much more delicate. They had been told to look into the growing rumours about the Kebra Nagast, the Ark of the Covenant, and the supposed descendants of Solomon. Still present at the Ethiopian royal court, they travelled secretly, dressed not in the bright purple of cardinals, but in simple robes and shoes. Their leader, Father Antonio Fernandez, was known for his calm nature and deep loyalty to the Church. He had spent years studying Eastern Church practices and had been chosen for this mission because of his ability to persuade. But as they went deeper into the Ethiopian highlands, something changed. Letters stopped coming, reports became fewer, and finally silence fell like granite. For over 12 months, the Vatican received nothing. Then, without warning, a single messenger appeared at the doors of the Apostolic Palace. He wasn't a Jesuit. He was a Portuguese merchant who had previously traded goods along the Red Sea coast. His message was short. They won't be coming back. The Vatican responded with a simple thank you. No investigation followed, no names were written in the memorial rooms, the entire mission was simply erased. But the whispers continued. One of them came decades later from a surviving Ethiopian document, secretly brought to Alexandria by a monk fleeing civil unrest. It described a discussion held in a granite holy place beneath the highlands, where 5 foreign priests argued against the contents of the Kebra Nagast. The manuscript doesn't name the priests, but it claims one of them cried when he heard the gaze chant spoken over the ark. If the story is true, then the Jesuits' mission didn't end in violence. It wasn't wiped out by sickness or wars. It was broken by revelation. They had travelled looking for falsehood and had found something they couldn't deny. A handwritten account from 1687, long buried in a minor collection at the Vatican Library, contains a mysterious statement. It says, "There are truths that once seen destroy those who see them. Ethiopia holds such a truth." In Rome, the story was never told. But in the hills of Lalibela, Monks still talk about visitors who came with foreign beliefs, stayed for a while, and left their Latin behind. They are not remembered as enemies, but as people who took part. And perhaps that's why the Vatican never sent another mission of that kind. Not because the first one failed, but because it succeeded in a way no one expected. A success that alarmed the Church more than any failure. A quiet surrender recorded not in writing but in silence. Deep in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, there's a place where the granite doesn't reach for the sky but goes down into the earth. A place where holy sites weren't built but carved, cut directly into the rock by hand, in silence. No framework, no wood, just tools, hammer and devotion. The settlement is called Lalibela, and for centuries its very existence has bothered the Vatican. There are 11 holy sites in Lalibela, each carved from a single block of volcanic granite, dug out from the top down. Walls, floors, supports, openings, all carved within the earth like rooms remembered from a vision. The craftsmanship is so precise, so amazing, that some of the first European travellers refused to believe it was made by human hands. But it was. According to Ethiopian tradition, the sanctuaries were built by King Lalibela in the 12th century after he had a vision of Jerusalem while in exile. Heavenly beings, the story goes, guided the workers, and every night while the men rested, the heavenly beings continued the work. In 24 years, the sanctuaries were finished, hidden in plain sight. The Vatican first learned about Lalibela through the stories of Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. What they described bothered their bosses. It wasn't just how they were built. It was the ceremonies. Ethiopian clergy sang in ge'ez, burned incense in underground chapels, and performed religious practices older than anything done in European lands. And underneath all that, there was something even more unsettling. A pattern from above. The way the sanctuaries were arranged wasn't random or accidental. It was a symbolic picture, some believed, that copied both Jerusalem and the heavenly layout described in the Book of Enoch. That same book the Vatican had long ignored. When a Jesuit returned to Rome with pictures of the place, he was told not to share them. His notes were taken, his observations quietly ignored. However, they still exist, handwritten and faded, buried in the Vatican's collection of restricted buildings. The real surprise came years later when a Vatican archaeologist working under a different project name visited Lalibela in 1964. He was there to study the building techniques, or so the official story went. But his secret notes, revealed only after he died, tell a different story. He claimed to have found writings inside the sanctuary walls, symbols that weren't Latin, but ancient Hebrew and Coptic. He described a hidden room under one of the chapels, secured with a panel that had no obvious way to be lifted. And in his final notes he wrote something that has puzzled researchers ever since. It's not that these sanctuaries were carved from granite. It's that they were carved from memory. The Vatican never talked about his discoveries, but no more trips were sent. In Lalibela, the quiet remains. The air smells of incense and cool granite. Worshippers walk barefoot through narrow paths, whispering prayers in a language older than Rome. And the secretly carved sanctuaries continue to hold their mystery, not above ground, but beneath it, where even the light has to bend. There are writings in the granite, carved deep into the walls of Lalibela's sanctuaries, engraved on supports, drawn in documents, sewn into old clothes. At first, they seem simple. A star, a cross, a flame. But the more you look at them, the more they start to change, not in their design, but in their meaning, because these aren't just decorations, they are messages, and some of them the Vatican can't explain. When Jesuit missionaries first visited the sanctuaries of Ethiopia in the 16th century, they expected to find small pieces of Christian truth. What they found instead was something complete and unknown. The symbols covering the walls were not like those in Rome. There were no precious metal halos, no Latin carvings. Instead, there were crosses with 12 arms, spheres inside celestial bodies, winged creatures with 6 eyes, and strange writing carved in flowing curves. They asked the clergy what the symbols meant. The answers were subtle. Some were too sacred to be explained. Others were older than memory itself. In Rome, the drawings of these symbols were put in secure containers and added to the secret files. For the next 3 centuries, several smart people tried to figure them out. One believed they came from ancient Hebrew mysticism. Another said they came from the early Egyptian church, hidden during the Roman Empire's persecutions. A third claimed they matched patterns seen in the Book of Enoch, symbols connected to the Watchers. But none of these answers solved the puzzle, because with each attempt to explain, more questions arose. In 1928, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni got rare access to a collection of Ethiopian documents. These manuscripts had been quietly obtained, not recorded, not shown. One book in particular caught his eye. It contained a list of symbols, each followed by a sequence of Ge'ez writing and what looked like a collection of instructions. One symbol, 3 interconnected spheres surrounding a single flame, was given a name Father Gianni had never seen. He sent a copy to the Department for the Doctrine of the Faith. Weeks later, he was moved to a different job. The manuscript disappeared from storage. Decades later, a researcher in France studying early Christian symbolism claimed to have found the same symbol carved into a wall beneath the Vatican, near the old burial ground under St. Peter's Basilica. When he asked for access to compare photos, he was denied without any explanation, only a letter saying the area was being renovated. But in Lalibela, the symbols remain untouched. Worshippers still touch them with their hands before praying. Monks still draw them in the margins of their manuscripts. They are not questioned. They are trusted. In the West, a symbol must be shown to have meaning. In Ethiopia, a symbol only needs to be remembered, and this is the mystery the Vatican cannot explain. These carvings in the granite don't talk to Rome. They talk to something older, something deeper, a truth passed down not through meetings or papal announcements, but through silence, movement, and belief. Under the red earth of northern Ethiopia, there's a passage few people talk about. It doesn't appear in official drawings. It's not mentioned in travel books or church records, yet it exists, carved into granite, hidden in the shadows, and it's said to connect 2 worlds that were never meant to meet. The passage was first found in 1931 by a group of local farmers near the edge of Lalibela. They were digging a water channel during a long dry spell when one man's tool hit empty space. What they found wasn't a cave, but a narrow passage that sloped perfectly down into the ground. It was lined with smooth walls, faintly carved with faded writings. In Ge'ez there were no steps or entrances, just the echo of their movements as they entered. News of the discovery reached the local clergy, who immediately ordered the area to be secured. But before that happened, a curious young man, the son of a merchant, snuck in with a flame in his hand. He went almost halfway down the passage, his flame flickering against the damp granite. What he found, at the end, would forever change how he saw his faith. The passage led to a small, hidden room under an old monastery. Inside was a single granite platform. On it, wrapped in dust, was a leather-bound manuscript. It wasn't in Ge'ez, it was in Latin. The unexpected development came when the young man, now an old man, told his story decades later to a French writer. According to him, the manuscript contained the notes of a European traveller. Not a missionary, but a scholar. A person who had come to Ethiopia not to change things, but to learn, and who had never left. In the margins of the pages, this person had written about ancient ceremonies he had seen. He described them as familiar, too familiar. He wrote about the similarities between Ethiopian religious practices and early Roman ones. The same symbols, the same prayers, even the same way the ceremony was set up. But the most surprising notes were at the end. He believed that this passage once connected our two sanctuaries. Before the meetings, before the separation, before the silence. In the Vatican, the existence of the passage was never acknowledged. But in 1974, the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples made a quiet request to send a secret group to Lalibela. The request was denied by the Ethiopian Church. They said the passage was sacred, not for study, only for remembrance. The Vatican didn't push the issue. To this day, the entrance to the passage remains sealed by granite and covered by plants. But among the oldest clergy in Lalibela, there is a saying. They don't say it loudly, only in prayer. The church was never separated from the land, only from memory. And deep within the earth, hidden from the eyes of popes and kings, a doorway between faiths may still exist, carved not in power, but in harmony. A passage that history books have missed, but the granite has not. The scholar's name was Father Emilio Dalba, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a voice rarely louder than a whisper. He was a linguist trained by the Vatican, skilled in Latin, Greek and Hebrew. But in his later years, it was the ancient language of Ethiopia, Ge'ez, that took all his attention. In 1969, the Vatican sent him to Ethiopia under the guise of a religious study. His official job was to compare Ethiopian Christian chanting with early Roman hymns, to find common origins and perhaps gently encourage doctrinal agreement. But those who knew him said his focus was deeper. He wasn't there to make traditions agree. He was there to understand why they had separated at all. Father Emilio lived for almost 5 years in the monastery on the Debre Damo Plateau, one of the oldest in Ethiopia. Cut off from roads, reachable only by a rope up a rock face, the monastery was a place of quiet and devotion. But beneath the prayers, the incense, and the granite rooms, something else was happening. He kept a journal written in secret by the light of a flame. He wrote down unknown chants, drew pictures of symbols carved into the walls, and made notes the Vatican had never seen. The monks trusted him. They believed he wasn't there to change them, and for the first time, Father Emilio felt he wasn't just studying a heritage anymore. He was experiencing it. Then came the last entry. It was written on a torn page, crumpled and hidden inside his suitcase, found only after his death. The handwriting was shaky, and there were dark smudges along the edges, as if it had been written quickly. This morning the manuscript was shown to me. Not a copy, not a story. The manuscript itself, bound in dark red leather, too old to tell its age, with pages that smelled of incense. The monks called it the memory of the flame. They say it should not be studied, but only received, and so they told me. A religious practice not found in any Vatican archive. The words came like air through the granite. It speaks of a time when all sanctuaries were united, before language separated us, before authority took power. It speaks of a covenant not broken, only moved, and in the margin a single phrase written in both Ge'ez and Latin. The ark was never removed, only hidden. That was the last thing he wrote. 3 days later, he was found alone, kneeling by a cliff, his hands pressed together in prayer. There were no signs of struggle, no pain, just silence. The Vatican retrieved his body but made no mention of his work. His journal, except for the last page, was never found, and the monks of Debre Damo gave no explanation, just a simple blessing. In Ge'ez, some believe he found peace, others believe he found something more, a truth too deep for Rome, too sacred for paper. And perhaps this is what alarmed the Vatican most, not that he had lost his faith, but that he had found it. The first thing you notice is the smell. Before your eyes adjust to the shadows, before your ears pick up the soft rhythm of ancient chanting, the scent reaches you. Sweet, smoky, and sharp. Incense slowly burning in a bronze pot, gently swaying from the hand of a barefoot priest. Below, even deeper, even older, rises the smell of carved rock, warmed by centuries of human breath and prayer. In the mountain sanctuaries of Ethiopia, everything moves slowly. The stone walls are massive and cool, carved directly from the living mountains. Light doesn't come from stained glass windows, but from subtle cracks carved into the rock, soft and amber. Darkness moves like flowing liquid. Forever the air holds this holy mix of vapour and granite, history and mystery. European scholars who make the journey often talk about feeling like they've stepped out of time. Yet for the clergy who live here, time has never left. The sacred words they say each sunrise remain unchanged from centuries before Rome set its official texts. The language flows in Ge'ez, a language the Vatican once studied but never fully understood. The rhythm is slow, the tones are deep. They don't rise for effect. They vibrate like the rock beneath your feet. A church leader visiting Italy in 1961 stayed 3 nights at a religious house near Axum. He was welcomed politely, visited the sanctuary, and joined in prayers. At first, he was puzzled by the lack of pews, the bare surfaces, the ancient, holy images darkened by generations of smoke. Then the change happened. During a midnight service, a young boy, barely 12, approached the holy altar carrying a small pot of smoking incense. As the church leader later wrote in an unpublished letter, the boy moved shoeless in complete silence except for the sound of the pot. In that moment, I felt the vapour carried more than a scent. It carried something ancient, something real. He left for Rome and never publicly discussed his experience. The revelation, like many Vatican mysteries, isn't in the event itself, but in what happened afterward. Soon after, his name disappeared from a group dealing with religious changes. His documents were quietly filed away. The smell of incense, so strong in his memories, gave way to the polished marble of St. Peter's Basilica. However, in the rock-hewn sanctuaries of Ethiopia, nothing changed. The clergy still rise before dawn. Incense is still lit from embers carried over each morning. Prayers slowly rise, like vapour seeking the sky. There are no written records of these events. Photography is not allowed. Yet, those who have witnessed that stony quiet carry it forever. Not as a memory, but as a trust. Because in that smell, incense and granite, there is something beyond ceremony. It is the scent of a story older than Rome, burning silently in the darkness, where language fails and only memory remains. In every grand cathedral, in every monastic archive, in every quiet chapel where manuscripts turn under candlelight, a question rings louder than any bell. What makes up the canon? Who decides? The canon is more than just a list of books. It's the line between truth and false teaching, between what lasts and what fades. It's the official statement of a belief system written in ink and defended by authority. Yet behind that statement, others have always existed, whispering from the darkness, questioning if the canon is complete. In the Western world, the biblical canon became fixed during the Council of Trent in the 16th century. It marked a time of trouble. Protestant reformers challenged established beliefs, producing Bibles in everyday languages and removing books they called secondary. The Vatican responded firmly. It drew a line with ink, definitely stating which books were holy and which were not. However, it's rarely acknowledged that this decision came late. For over 1,000 years, various Christian communities considered different manuscripts divine. Some embraced the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and even Gospels that told stories of Mary and other early followers. The Ethiopian Church, which practiced Christianity long before the Council of Trent, kept many of these books, and it still guards them. This is where the mystery begins. When Jesuit scholars first arrived in Ethiopia, they expected to find a simpler form of Christianity. Instead, they found something much older. Their guides had leather-bound Bibles, written in Ge'ez, that contained books Rome had long rejected. These manuscripts weren't added later. They were there from the start. The tension became clear. If Ethiopia kept these manuscripts from the earliest days of Christianity, could it be that the Vatican had removed them? A letter, written in 1694 by a Jesuit priest, showed his worry after looking at the Book of Enoch. If this manuscript told the truth, then heavenly beings came down and humanity held knowledge. Rome has no place for such memories. That letter remained unpublished. Today it's still in a sealed envelope in the Vatican archives. But Ethiopia stood firm. The revelation goes beyond just historical meaning. It becomes personal. The canon isn't just about which books are studied. It's about who controls the story. When the Vatican set its canon, it wasn't just naming sacred manuscripts. It was silencing other options. In Ethiopia, the canon isn't a wall, but an open door. It includes stories of heavenly beings coming down, hidden knowledge, and visions that go beyond the stars. These aren't rejected, they are welcomed. That's why this research is so important. What makes up the canon? Who gets to decide? Because sometimes the most dangerous truths are the ones left out. Inside those forgotten manuscripts, a completely different story waits to be found again. The Church's history isn't just written in books, it's written in fire. For every manuscript carefully kept in the Vatican library, others were burned, hidden, or disappeared. Some faded over time. Others were intentionally made to vanish. In the early centuries after Christ, the Church didn't have one set Bible. Different communities studied different Gospels. Some had Paul's letters. Others followed manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Gospel of Mary. In the Egyptian deserts and the Ethiopian highlands, believers copied these writings by hand, relying on spiritual guidance. But in Rome, a new authority rose, along with a fear that too many voices would break up the truth, a fear that mystery would turn into chaos, a fear that uncontrolled stories would spark questions no pope could answer. So, decisions were made. At the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century and later at the Council of Carthage, church leaders began to form the canon. Certain books were praised, others quietly disappeared. At the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the list was finalised, and all outside manuscripts were called apocryphal, or worse, false teachings. Many of these discarded books vanished from Europe. However, in Ethiopia, they survived. This is what makes the Ethiopian Bible so threatening from the Vatican's view. It's not just old, it's complete. It keeps what others tried to get rid of. A Jesuit priest stationed in the Ethiopian highlands in 1673 wrote a document that never made it to Rome. It was found years later in a sealed container. Inside he described a holy ceremony where the brothers recited parts of the Book of Jubilees. He was amazed to see the group respond with complete familiarity of the manuscript as if it had been passed down from ancestor to descendant. He wrote, "These are not rebels, they are keepers of what we have given up. Their worship brings back sounds we had silenced before." That silence didn't always come peacefully. In France, during the Albigensian Crusade, entire archives burned because they held writings labelled as wrong beliefs. In Spain, during the Inquisition, copies of Gospels thought to be fake were seized and destroyed. In Italy, certain manuscripts were kept in monasteries with orders never to copy them. Yet the surprising truth is that even in the Vatican's own private archives, some of these supposedly forbidden books still remain. Not displayed, not for study, just kept safe. Some have crimson wax seals, others show warnings in Latin, non videre, non legere. Do not look, do not study, But the fires never touched Ethiopia. The books were kept. Today, centuries later, they offer a different kind of light. Not a fire that burns, but one that reveals, a reminder that sometimes the most threatening thing a book can do is to simply exist. She was there, at the beginning, at the execution site, at the empty tomb, in the meeting room, where the wind moved freely. Mary Magdalene, whose identity was mentioned in all parts of the early church, was more than just an observer. Some called her the apostle to the apostles. But in the vast Vatican record of holy manuscripts, her voice slowly faded until it disappeared. But not everywhere. In the highlands of Ethiopia, kept safe in a monastery untouched by time, a single book remained. Its pages were bound by hand, its ink faded with age, yet its message was clear. It was a gospel, not of Peter, not of John, but of Mary. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene never made it into the canon chosen by the Vatican. It was among the books that worried early church leaders, not because of what it said, but because of who wrote it. In this Gospel, Mary doesn't stay silently in the background. She speaks, she teaches. She shares visions of the Spirit's journey beyond death. She faces challenges not from enemies, but from other followers. Peter, in one part, asks why Jesus would speak to a woman privately and not to them all together. Mary answers calmly, not with power, but with peace. Her voice holds no anger, only sadness, as if she already knew her story would be erased. The Vatican never officially recognized this gospel. For centuries it was thought to be lost, existing only in pieces found in desert caves. However, in the early 1900s, a copy written in Ge'ez was found in a remote Ethiopian monastery near Lake Tana. This version was longer, more complete, and unlike the European pieces, it had been read in ceremonies for generations. A Jesuit missionary named Father Lucian was the first outsider to see it. He wrote in his journal, "They speak of Mary as one speaks of Paul, not as a helper but as a founder. Her words are not an extra detail, they are the foundation." He sent a request to the Vatican to study the manuscript further. The answer came quickly. His assignment was over. He was called back to Rome and never sent on another mission. The manuscript itself remained untouched. The brothers refused to give it up. They called it the voice beneath the silence. For them, Mary had not been erased. She had been preserved. In every song sung by candlelight, in every story passed down from ancestor to descendant, she was part of the foundation of their faith. Perhaps this is the mystery Rome cannot solve. In its archives, the Gospel of Mary exists only in fragments. In Ethiopia, it thrives. A voice once silenced by councils now speaks from mountaintops and night prayers, not with the thunder of authority, but with the sweetness of truth. Within that sweet voice, something threatening still remains. Not rebellion, but remembrance. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, where marble floors echo under long robes and oil lamps flicker against ancient walls, there's a truth almost too delicate to say aloud. The Bible, as people understand it today, wasn't just put together, it was rebuilt. The word rebuilt makes people uneasy, but in the early centuries of the Church, Scripture wasn't one thing, but many scrolls. Stories of Jesus, of the apostles, of heavenly beings and visions, travelled across deserts, mountains and oceans, copied by hand, passed from mind to hand, never exactly the same twice. Early Christians weren't just collectors, they were gatherers of wonders. But as the Church grew, so did its fear of disorder. Too many voices, too many versions threatened the control Rome had started. The gathering, the need for order, led to councils, meetings of church leaders who argued not just about beliefs, but about which words should last forever and which should quietly disappear. At the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the Bible was declared complete. No more changes, no more additions, no more wandering gospels. It was sealed with authority and protected with fire. But what happened before that closing? In the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome was asked by the Pope to create a single official version of the Scriptures, working from earlier Hebrew, Greek, and Latin manuscripts. He created what would become the Vulgate, the basis of the Roman Bible. But Jerome didn't just translate. He made choices. He rearranged the books. He left some out. He added notes with warnings. He called the Book of Enoch dangerous. He called the Shepherd of Hermas a made-up story. His choices, made in the quiet of his room, would echo for centuries. The Vatican never hid this story. It just never highlighted it. In Ethiopia, things were different. Their Bible was never rebuilt to match the West. It remained large, unusual, and sacred. It kept Enoch, it kept Jubilees, it kept the Gospel of Mary, and others long removed by Rome. It wasn't cut down to fit the councils, it was defended as a living memory. A Vatican scholar working in the archives in 1971 found a collection of handwritten notes tucked into an old Latin Bible. They were from a 12th century church leader who had met an Ethiopian brother during a pilgrimage. In the note he wrote, "Their Bible is wild, yet it burns with truth. Ours is refined, theirs thrives." That observation remained unpublished. Perhaps this is the deepest mystery of all. Not what stayed in, but what was left out. Not which stories survived, but who decided they should. The rebuilding of the Bible wasn't a solo act. It was a quiet battle fought with ink, secured by authority, and kept only in whispers. But in Ethiopia, the older story continues to move barefoot and unchanged through the manuscripts of faith. This is what Rome fears most. Not falsehoods, but the truth it chose to remove. In the dry plains of Ethiopia, far from the cave churches of Lalibela and the site of any cardinal, there are caves the Vatican has never entered. These caves don't ring with bells or ceremonies. They breathe silence. Inside, guarded behind makeshift rock barriers and worn goatskin tents, lie the books civilization should never have seen. For centuries, desert monks have retreated to these caves not to leave civilization, but to protect it. They carry no weapons. They make no promises of greatness. What they defend is older than precious metal and more threatening than swords. They defend words. These books aren't kept in archives. They are wrapped in cloth, tucked into rock cracks, and passed down through generations with whispered instructions. Never trade, never copy, never reveal. Each book tells a different story. One speaks of heavenly beings who taught humanity to write down forbidden knowledge. Another describes the early parts of Mary Magdalene's journey to Egypt. There are scrolls that describe visions of heaven opening, revealing not judgment but memory. In 1932, a European explorer crossing the Danakil Depression was given shelter by a desert monk during a sandstorm. The monk, a figure with eyes like weathered granite, offered him water and a warning. "Avoid asking about the books," he said. The explorer, driven by curiosity, asked anyway. Later that night, the brother brought out a small, dark book wrapped in palm leaves. He didn't open it. He simply said, "This was not written on earth. It was kept in memory." The researcher documented this moment in his journal. He sent the observations to an institution in France, where they gathered dust for decades. Later they caught the attention of the Vatican. A quiet investigation began. No formal answer was ever given. The revelation came in 1977 when a Vatican archivist named Father Borgia wrote an unpublished letter to an associate stating that a collection of unclassified manuscripts from Ethiopia had appeared in Rome. The writing was in Ge'ez. The content, he argued, echoed parts of the Book of Noah thought to be lost forever. But the revelation wasn't in what the books claimed, it was in what they didn't claim. There was no mention of Peter, no mention of Rome. Just a quiet, clear voice speaking through centuries of sand and hiding. A voice that didn't seek approval. A voice that never asked for canonization. The Vatican didn't confirm the existence of those manuscripts, but since then, no further expeditions to the Danakil territory have been authorised. Officially, the caves have no church importance, but the brothers continue. Their fires still burn. The books, protected from popes and scholars, rest where they were first placed. Not behind clear barriers, but in the embrace of granite. Not lost, not removed. Just waiting. In the early months of 1625, in the shadow of a growing moon and the quiet of closed tents, a sealed order was given to a Jesuit named Father Matteo Serrano. He wasn't a famous scholar or a high-ranking cardinal. He was chosen for a different reason: his obedience. The mission was clear, though never openly stated. Travel to the Ethiopian highlands, find the source of the religious disagreement, and if necessary, fix it. The letter he carried had no emblem, just a scarlet wax seal with a cross, different from any other used in Rome. It was meant to be opened only after he had travelled beyond the reach of known maps. Even among his Jesuit friends, the mission was only mentioned by its name, Lux Caecus, the blind light. Father Matteo arrived in Massawa by sea, then went inland on an animal's back, following a path worn by traders and pilgrims. He kept to himself, writing long observations in a leather journal tucked into his clothes. When asked what he was doing in Ethiopia, he simply replied that he was examining the light. But it wasn't the light that drew him. It was a book, rumoured to contain parts not found in any Western canon. A book said to contradict Rome's understanding of the Trinity. A book the Vatican wanted to be recovered or destroyed. The locals were cautious. They had seen figures like him before. Some came with blessings, others with fire. In the village of Adwa, Father Matteo found shelter in a granite monastery built against the mountain. The brothers there were thoughtful but quiet. They spoke softly and often disappeared for periods, returning with faces marked by ash. There Father Matteo saw the leather-bound volume, edged with iron clasps, its writing etched in Ge'ez, flowing like river water across the manuscript. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the silence that followed. As the religious brothers turned the pages of the manuscripts, the realization didn't come from what he found, but from what he felt. In a letter never sent, found years later in a forgotten Vatican container, Father Matteo wrote, "I was sent here to fix a fake gospel, and yet what I found was a complete gospel. They didn't abandon Christ, they kept him in a different way. He never left." Some say he died of illness. Others say he chose to stay, taking on a new identity and disappearing into the rhythm of monastic life. The Vatican recorded the mission as unfinished. The document was closed without details. However, the Ethiopian religious brothers keep the memory alive. Every year, on the same day he arrived, they light a single flame in a room where no devotion is openly spoken. In the light of that flame, the manuscripts of the guarded volume continue to be passed from hand to hand. Not removed, not corrected, just studied. The city of Aksum was quiet that morning. The market hadn't started yet, and the carved monuments stood like frozen giants under the pale Sunday sun. The passages held the scent of coffee, earth, and incense, as always. Yet, something wasn't right. At the eastern entrance, under a twisted fig tree, two figures waited. One wore the white robes of an Ethiopian religious brother, the other the dark cassock of a Vatican representative. They didn't speak. Their meeting wasn't recorded in any official document. However, what they exchanged changed the fate of both churches. The identity of the religious brother has been lost over time. Some say he was a guardian of the Ark, a figure dedicated to silence and isolation. Others say he was previously a priest in Rome who disappeared during an expedition and reappeared years later in the Ethiopian highlands, changed and mysterious. The Vatican representative was Father Aldo Marchesi, sent under direct orders to get back what he called the disputed manuscripts. His mission was to retrieve a small collection of manuscripts believed to contain versions of the scriptures long removed from the Western canon. However, Father Marchesi had been warned. The Vatican wasn't just worried about theology, it understood something deeper. An ancient alliance kept in plain sight. The idea that the Church in Ethiopia wasn't a branch of Rome, but its equal. In his unreleased observations found after his disappearance, Father Marchesi described a meeting held the night before in a small granite shrine on the outskirts of the city. The religious brother had shown him a volume wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. Inside were manuscripts of devotions unlike anything he had studied. They talked about a time when heaven and earth were connected, when Christ not only walked through Galilee, but also along the Red Sea. The identities of the apostles were different. The structure of the church was different. There was no mention of Peter's authority, only of unity, broken. Then came the betrayal. The next day, the Vatican representative returned with 2 guards and demanded the manuscript. The religious brother, still calm, refused. What happened next was never fully told. However, by nightfall the volume was gone. The shrine was sealed, and Father Marchesi's guards were seen leaving with a sealed container under a thick cloth. That night, the representative disappeared. Some said he fled to Rome, shamed by what he had done. Others whispered that he never left Axum, that the volume he took wasn't what it seemed, that the religious brother's silence wasn't submission but caution. The Vatican never acknowledged what happened. In official documents, Father Marchesi is listed as transferred without assignment. The sealed container was never found. However, in Axum, the crossroads still hold the memory. The residents still place stones at the base of the fig tree, not as signs of sadness, but as reminders that even where faith is strong, trust can be broken. Sometimes, what is taken cannot be carried away. In the dark parts of the secret archives, under layers of dust and guarded silence, rests an unmarked container. Inside are precisely folded documents held by a weakened silk clasp. They are not marked as formal letters, and yet there is no closing, no reply. These are the letters never sent. The writer was Father Domenico Farina, a Jesuit scholar previously stationed in Gondar in the late 17th century. His mission, according to Vatican guidelines, was simple. Observe Ethiopian ceremonies and document doctrinal differences. However, what started as an academic assignment soon became something else. The longer he spent among the priests and religious brothers of the Ethiopian Church, the more unsure he became of his personal goal. He began to write a series of unreleased letters addressed to the Superior General of the Jesuit Order, known in church circles as the Black Pope. These weren't dry field reports, they were confessions. His words were careful, and yet there was a quiet desperation beneath the surface. He described liturgies that seemed older than any Roman manuscript. He wrote about children reciting psalms from volumes that had never been translated into Latin. He spoke of icons that showed Christ with unknown symbols, heavenly bodies, wings, circles within circles. In one letter, dated March 5th, 1778, he wrote, "I no longer believe we were sent to correct them. I believe we were sent to prevent them from correcting us." However, here's the surprise. None of these letters were sent. They were found untouched in a container located behind a fake panel in the Vatican's conservation chambers during restorations in 1954. The container had been sealed so carefully that the custodians initially thought it was part of a forgotten surface. They expected worn translations or faded travel records when they opened it. What they discovered instead was the trembling voice of a man whose faith had begun to fall apart. One letter in particular caught their attention. It was sealed with wax, though no official mark was printed on the red surface. 3 crosses, intertwined, marked the seal. Father Domenico wrote about a meeting inside, a meeting with a high-ranking Ethiopian priest who revealed a single page of a manuscript that the West believed lost forever. The Book of the Mysteries of the Heavens and the Earth. This priest insisted that it had remained hidden since the 4th century. He told Father Domenico that Rome had stripped away certain truths and that Ethiopia had protected them, not out of fear but out of conviction. A single line closes the letter. If this truth ever comes to light, it will not be through debate, but through recognition. Why did these letters never reach their destination? Did someone silence Father Domenico? Or did he embrace the silence willingly, understanding that certain truths resist explanation and only demand protection? The Vatican has not made any statement about what was found. The bag returned to storage without ceremony, filed without any designation. However, the letters remain, and through their silence, a signal continues to echo. Not one of rebellion, not one of resistance, but something much older, a voice that once spoke in devotion, now whispers from the forgotten corners of history. The air in Debre Libanos remained still that May morning, as if the world itself had stopped to listen. Carved into the cliffs north of Addis Ababa, the monastery had stood for generations as a sanctuary of thought, devotion, and memory. However, in 1937, that quiet was broken not by sacred sounds, but by the crackle of rifles. Italian control of Ethiopia had already caused suffering throughout the region, but the events at Debre Libanos left a scar so deep that even historians struggle to revisit it. More than 2,000 monks, deacons, and faithful gathered there for the annual celebration of the monastery's founding. Most arrived on foot, carrying only belief and simple supplies. However, others were watching. Italian forces, following the orders of General Pietro Maletti, surrounded the place, claiming to have uncovered a conspiracy, a supposed link between religious figures and an attack on the Italian viceroy. The Vatican during that period made no public acknowledgement. The Church of Rome remained silent even as the massacre began. As night fell, the green slopes surrounding Debre Libanos turned dark with blood. The clergy, from elderly monks to young novices, were lined up and fell along the river that flowed below the cliff edge. Their bodies rolled down the ravine, their identities never fully recorded. But this is where the mystery deepens. 3 scribes died that day who had worked on a particular code, a handmade illuminated volume containing rare sections of the Book of Baruch, the Book of Tobit, and the Book of Enoch. The code would have contained a commentary written by an anonymous Ethiopian theologian describing the arrival of European missionaries and warning against Rome's scriptural distortions. The code disappeared without a trace. The Vatican did not start any official search to retrieve it. Years later, however, a letter emerged, written by a Red Cross volunteer who travelled to the area after the massacre. She described seeing a soldier leave the scene with a package wrapped in leather and covered in ash. Questioned about its contents, the soldier replied, "Just a book, one they defended with their lives." Vatican records contain no formal acknowledgement of the massacre. Even in contemporary Vatican references to the Ethiopian war events, Debre Libanos receives little mention. Brief passages appear in internal documents labelled with terms like sensitive and unverified. However, the Ethiopian Church keeps the memory. Every year the monks gather on that same ground, lighting flames not only for the fallen but for what disappeared. They say that the code survives, hidden by one of the surviving novices, passed down in secret, not for revenge, not for show, but for safekeeping. Some secrets rest under silence, others under bloodshed. The train arrived in Rome at dawn. A thick fog covered the tracks, wrapping the station in a muffled silence, as if the city hesitated before waking up. Among the few travellers who stepped onto the platform, one figure stood out. His coat was torn, his bag was worn, his neck, once stiff with dignity, now hung under the weight of distance and stillness. Father Luca Benedetti was his name. 5 years had passed since he left. sent to Ethiopia by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, Father Luca's task was described in uncertain but urgent language. His goal? To build a new understanding with the Ethiopian Church, clarify religious teaching, and most importantly, retrieve particular texts rumoured to exist among the remote clergy. The Vatican was worried about rumours of alternative gospels, visions and manuscripts still circulating beyond Rome's influence. They chose him for his obedience, not for his curiosity, not for his courage, but only for his devotion. However, something changed in those highlands. When Father Luca returned, no assembly greeted him, no ringing of St. Peter's bells, no waiting vehicle, only a solitary assistant from the Vatican archives holding a message with a single instruction: report immediately to the congregation. He never obeyed. Instead, he went directly to his rooms near the Lateran Palace, where he drew the curtains and lit a single flame. He emptied his bag carefully. Inside were no volumes, manuscripts, documents, only a small folded cloth. When he opened it, a single page of parchment fell to the surface. The writing was Ge'ez. At the bottom, a sign. 3 crosses joined in a circle. He placed it on the surface and studied it all night. That night he wrote a message, not addressed to the Vatican, but to a colleague with whom he had trained long ago. In the message, he admitted something extraordinary. "I left to change them," he wrote, "but the change came to me. I discovered a faith not buried in ceremony, but breathing in memory. They preserve truths that we have buried under stone and procedure, and I worry. No. I realise that if Rome saw what I have seen, the foundations would break." The message never left his possession. It reappeared in his drawer years later. After his death, the Vatican never questioned him. No conference ever appeared in the records, no official statement issued. He simply disappeared from view, assigned to an obscure clerical position on the outskirts of the city. A man who had travelled to the ends of history without recognition, without victory, and an unspeakable truth. The revelation. When his rooms were emptied, that single page of parchment had disappeared. And no one, not the archivists, not the priests, not the Swiss guard on duty, could explain how the locked room had been entered. Sometimes the greatest danger of power is not force, it is witness. High in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where oxygen is scarce and trees bend under persistent winds, stands a monastery older than memory. They call it Abba Garima, after the saint who founded it more than 1,000 years ago. Some say he travelled from the east on foot. Others insist he descended from the clouds during a storm, holding a volume that glowed in the rain. The Vatican has known about Abba Garima for generations. It appears in old mission documents as a place of importance, highlighted in red ink, but never explored in depth. What makes this place more than folklore is a single manuscript, a book so old that experts suspect it may be the oldest Christian text still in its original binding. Its pages catch the light in a strange way, written in Ge'ez, untouched by decay. But what really bothered the Vatican wasn't its age. It was a vision, recorded on its final pages with faded pigment, attributed to Abba Garima himself. The vision describes an era when truth would not travel through kings or fortress walls, an era when the right scrolls would last longer than mighty cathedrals. It warns against a distant church, wrapped in wealth and darkness, that would lose sight of the face of Christ. When the Vatican first learned of the manuscript in 1958, it sent a group quietly. Not an official mission, but 3 researchers. Under the guise of pilgrimage, they were instructed to examine the book, confirm its authenticity, and, if circumstances allowed, arrange for its transfer to Rome for preservation. The monks refused. One researcher, a young Italian scholar named Lorenzo Bellini, kept a diary. In it, he tells of the moment he saw the last page. The monks allowed him a single look. No golden decorations, no fancy designs, no attribution appeared. Simply a sentence that read, "He who changes the word will lose the word." That night, the Vatican delegation left without the manuscript. However, Bellini never saw Italy again. 14 days later, he sent a message to his relatives explaining that he had decided to stay in Ethiopia. He wanted to learn the ancient language, walk the paths of the desert saints, and explore what he called a more authentic memory. No other news came from him. The Vatican never acknowledged the vision. It remains absent from official documents. The name Abagarima rarely appears in church texts, except in a brief mention. However, deep in those mountains, the book rests in a modest stone chamber wrapped in cloth, guarded by a solitary monk who refuses to sleep indoors. They consider the vision not a warning. They consider it a recognition that truth, once spoken, belongs not to those who fear it, but to those who quietly carry it through the centuries. In 1931, under the dim flicker of an oil lamp, a British scholar named Edward Mallory opened a wooden chest in a hilltop monastery near Lake Tana. He had come looking for stories, not wonders. However, what he found that night would haunt him forever. Inside, the chest lay 3 manuscripts wrapped in ancient layers of linen, their edges curled and worn from centuries of careful handling. The monks called them Eyes of the Night. Initially, Mallory thought it was a poetic way of speaking. But as the flame flickered and the room plunged into almost complete darkness, something extraordinary happened. The characters on the manuscripts began to glow. It wasn't a bright light, or the glow of an insect, or the shine of a gold leaf. It was more delicate, like moonbeams on water. Each line in Ge'ez seemed lit from beneath the ink, giving off a soft blue glow that rippled across the parchment. Mallory, bothered but also fascinated, asked the monk next to him about this strange sight. The old man smiled gently and said that some words weren't written with ink. They were captured with light. Mallory later wrote about this in his personal diary. This entry was never meant for others to read. He was afraid of being made fun of, or even worse, having the manuscripts taken away. But years later, that diary ended up in a small library in Cambridge. There, in faded handwriting, his notes talked about 3 books unlike anything he had ever seen in the Middle East, North Africa, or Europe. He had written, "These are not stories, they are clues, but no description of what they were like can match the feeling of being near them in the dark." The words seemed to pulse with life. News of the glowing manuscripts quietly reached the Vatican through a Jesuit language expert stationed in Cairo. A request was made to move the manuscripts to Rome for study and protection. The monks at Lake Tana said no. However, weeks later, during monsoon season, lightning struck the monastery. Part of their archive room was destroyed. 2 monks died. The chest was never found in the rubble. This could have been the end of the story. But here's the twist. In 1972, a visiting cardinal who was touring the Vatican Library mentioned something odd. He claimed to have seen a sealed glass container in a restricted hallway that held a manuscript that glowed when the lights were off. When he asked about it, the archivist changed the subject. There is no official record of such a manuscript in the Vatican's catalogue. However, in a restricted storage area known only to a few chosen church officials, there are unmarked, unlabelled containers. Just shadows and quiet. To this day, some suspect the manuscripts were never destroyed, that the Vatican has at least one. Not to show it off, but to hide it. Because if words can glow in the dark, maybe they hold something more than just ink and memories. Maybe they hold the one thing authority fears most. A truth that refuses to die out. In the spring of 1924, a rolled-up scroll arrived at the Vatican Library. wrapped in goatskin and tied with a braided reed cord. It had no sender's name, just a hidden note in the wrapping, found near the source of the Blue Nile. Don't rush the translation. The manuscript passed from scholar to scholar, from expert to expert. At first glance it looked like any typical Ethiopian document written in Ge'ez, maybe even Sabaean. However, as they unrolled the scroll and looked at the symbols, unease spread through the room. It wasn't Ge'ez, it wasn't Hebrew, it wasn't Arabic, Aramaic, Latin or Coptic. The writing curved like vines, but it didn't match any known alphabet. Some characters floated above the lines like steam. Others curled inward, as if they were meant to be understood not with sight, but with the spirit. For weeks, the Vatican's best language experts worked quietly. They looked through old dictionaries and forgotten manuscripts, even comparing it to mystical alphabets supposedly used by early visionaries. Nothing brought clarity. The spacing of the lines suggested a rhythm, like a chant or a prayer, but it didn't line up with any known language. Cardinal Severino, who was in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, personally visited the study room. After looking at the manuscript, he ordered it to be sealed, but not before muttering something to his assistant. If it resists being read, it wasn't meant for our eyes. However, here the mystery deepens. In 1926, a Jesuit missionary named Father Auguste Lemaitre, stationed in Eritrea, reported seeing a monk reading aloud from a manuscript that had the same writing. He described the sound as haunting, musical and echoing, even though the reader was barely whispering. When asked about the language, the monk calmly replied, "It is the language of those who existed before Babel." Father Lemaitre captured the moment in a private message sent to Rome, which was later sealed and never made public. However, decades later, a researcher working in the Vatican's restricted archives found a part of that message. The final sentence read, "I understood nothing and yet I wept." The twist wasn't in decoding it, but in the visions. Many scholars who looked closely at the manuscript started having vivid dreams, images of crystal cities, staircases rising into the clouds, and voices singing without words. One professor left Rome completely, retiring to a monastery in silence. Another disappeared during a trip to Jerusalem. To this day, the Vatican denies having such a manuscript. No record of the writing appears in their public records. However, it's whispered among some archivists that the manuscript wasn't meant to be decoded because it doesn't speak to the mind. It speaks to memory. Not the memory of one person or even a civilization, but something much older. A language spoken before time kept records, before stories were written down, when reality moved from spirit to spirit, not from page to page. In the winter of 1963, during an unusually cold December, a container arrived at the Vatican from Addis Ababa. It had no diplomatic symbols, no official identification, just a handwritten label for the secret archive, "Handle with reverence." The container was plain, no bigger than a suitcase, yet its contents would spark quiet discussions for generations. Inside rested a single book, tightly bound in something that wasn't quite leather. The texture was strange, flexible but not animal skin. The archivist who first unpacked it later described the feeling as flesh that remembered being alive. No title on the cover, no symbols, no seals, just a faint discoloration. The shadow of a palm pressed against the binding as if someone long gone had touched it last. The Vatican first classified it as Codex Obscura, Item 4, a temporary name. However, the scholars who looked at it privately started calling it something else. The Gospel of Flesh. Some insisted the pages were made of regular parchment. However, the cover presented a different situation. A biologist from the University of Milan was quietly invited to analyze the material. She concluded that the genetic structure matched human tissue, possibly from several different people. That conclusion was never made public. Her lab was later destroyed in a fire. No one was hurt, but the original samples were lost. However, the mystery didn't end with the skin. Inside the book were texts that had no known origin. They referred to stories from the Book of Enoch, parts of apocalyptic visions, and prayers written in Ge'ez not found in any other manuscript. One part described a hidden portal in a wasteland beyond, where angels no longer help but watch. Another told of beings from high realms coming down, not fallen, but sent to teach, warn, and witness. One specific section bothered the scholars the most. It detailed a ceremony where understanding isn't read, but absorbed through touch. The reader must place their palm on the cover and understand not with their ears, but with what the text called the bone behind the breath. No one would admit to trying it, yet a priest, a man named Father Roberto Sella, was found in his room days later, surrounded by candles and scribbled pages. He had written the same phrase over and over. He is not dead. He is only watching. The Vatican removed the book from circulation. It now sits in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. Officially, it doesn't exist. The container it arrived in was thrown away. The archivist who received it was moved to a distant post in South America. However, the legend lives on. Some believe the book was wrapped in human flesh, not to honour the dead, but to trap what was inside, that it's not just a text, but a container, and that if it's ever fully open, not with hands, but with belief, it could communicate again. The question remains, to whom? In 1939, while the outside world was caught in war, a quiet discovery was made beneath the marble floors of the Vatican Library. A monk named Brother Anselmo, tasked with restoring delicate manuscripts, received a bundle of old parchments taken from an unmarked container. The pages were fragile with age, but strangely preserved by time. What first caught his eye wasn't the language, though it was Ge'ez, an ancient script few could read. It was the ink. It glowed subtly, like fresh paint on stone. Even though the pages were supposed to be over 1,000 years old, no matter how often they were handled, no matter how much they were exposed to light or air, the characters stayed bright. No mark had faded. Brother Anselmo, a man skilled in the slow art of preservation, had never seen anything like it. He called it the breathing ink. Vatican conservators analysed the manuscript under a microscope, looking for answers. The ink had no traces of iron, oak gall, or carbon. When examined, it acted strangely, glowing in candlelight, but appearing dull in sunlight. And at night, if left alone in the dark, the pages gave off a soft blue light, as if they held the memory of being read. One section in particular immediately caught attention. A short phrase written in larger letters than the rest, 5 words placed in the middle of the page. Roughly translated, it said, "Reality is preserved in the flame." The moment this phrase was written down, the manuscript was taken out of circulation, but not before a young Ethiopian scholar named Temesgen Yohannes sketched the page. He had been invited by a kind Jesuit to help with the translation. However, after copying the phrase, he was removed from the task without explanation. Days later, his simple guest room near the Tiber River was found empty. There was no evidence of a struggle, just a page torn from his abandoned notebook under his pillow. The twist came 2 years later, during an unrelated examination of medieval texts from the northern highlands of Ethiopia. A Vatican researcher discovered an almost identical phrase written in the margin of a completely separate book. Identical style, identical ink, identical glow. However, this book had never left Ethiopia. The 2 volumes were separated by oceans, by centuries, but they showed the same hand, or so it seemed. The ink, it appeared, wasn't just a substance, it was memory. To this day, the Vatican won't talk about the manuscript. It's reported to be sealed in the secret archive, placed inside a lead-lined container, kept away from light, not because it's delicate, but because of what it resists: silence, darkness, erasure. Brother Anselmo died in 1952. His last words, whispered to the attending librarian, were simple. It's not that the ink cannot fade, it's that the truth. They say the Ark of the Covenant has disappeared into history, consumed by conflicts, flames, or looting. However, in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, under the shade of whispering fig trees, stands a simple chapel guarded by a single man. He never leaves the grounds. He doesn't talk to visitors. He doesn't eat with others. His life is dedicated to one purpose: protecting what his community believes is the most sacred object on earth. The Ark. Not a copy, not a representation. The Ark. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark arrived in Aksum almost 3,000 years ago, brought by Menelik, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It wasn't stolen. They claim it was entrusted, taken from Jerusalem with heaven's own blessing, carried across deserts and mountain ranges, hidden in the highlands. Since then, it has been defended by generations of monks, watched over by a solitary guardian, chosen for life. The Vatican has never officially recognised the claim, but that hasn't stopped their interest. In the early 20th century, a series of Vatican representatives were quietly sent to Ethiopia. Their missions were unannounced, and there were no documented discoveries. One of them, Father Bartolomeo Giusti, wrote a message now sealed deep within the secret archive. In it, he describes the outer structure of the Aksum Chapel and the ceremonies around it. He never saw the Ark, but he described sensing something ancient and overwhelming, as if the earth itself held the memory of what rested inside. What the Vatican feared wasn't just the possibility that the Ark was real, but that it had never belonged to them. Rome had spent centuries building the tools of authority. Relics were more than sacred. They were ways to control. Bones of martyrs, pieces of the true cross, thorns from the crown, all carefully kept in golden containers. However, the Ark, that was different. The Ark was the very voice of God. It had parted waters, brought down walls, condemned kings. If such an object rested not in Rome, but in Africa, the entire structure of church authority would crumble. The twist came during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. In 1937, Italian forces, under Mussolini's government, advanced towards the Aksum Chapel. They never crossed the threshold. According to testimony recorded years later by an Ethiopian priest, the soldiers stopped at the chapel entrance, looked up at the sky, and retreated. One of them claimed to have heard a sound like thunder, even though the sky was clear. What happened that day remains unexplained. However, afterward, the Vatican's investigations into the Ark stopped. No more messages, no more missions. Today the chapel still stands. The Guardian still watches. No photographs show the inside. No scholar has confirmed what lies within. However, the quietness carries meaning. Because in the deepest chambers of the Vatican, where the oldest secrets rest behind secure compartments, there is an unmarked folder, and inside it, they claim, there is only one thing. A map of Aksum, folded 12 times, and a single word written at the top, returned. In the centre of Aksum, behind a tall stone wall and an iron gate, stands a cathedral most people will never see. Inside, it's not grand, not gilded, not filled with travellers or music. It's modest, even plain from the outside. Yet, it holds a stillness that feels heavy. This is the chapel that guards the tablet, the most forbidden place in all of Ethiopia. No one enters. Not priests, not kings, not scholars, not presidents. Only one man, the guardian of the Ark, is allowed to cross that threshold. He never leaves these grounds. He never speaks to reporters. He rests in a small stone dwelling next to the chapel and dedicates his entire life to protecting what lies within. The structure you see today isn't ancient. It was rebuilt during the 20th century right next to the older St. Mary of Zion Cathedral. But what is kept inside is believed to be thousands of years old. Legend says the Ark of the Covenant rests within those walls, brought to Ethiopia by Menelik, son of King Solomon, and hidden there ever since. The Vatican has never directly denied this story, but they haven't confirmed it either. In 1978, a Vatican official named Monsignor Paolo Mancini travelled to Aksum, stating his purpose was interfaith dialogue. What he really wanted was a glimpse of that sacred artefact. He met with community leaders, visited churches, made offerings, but when he asked for access to the chapel, the answer was a clear no. He left Aksum 48 hours later and never mentioned that trip publicly again. However, 5 years later, his private diary reappeared. After his disappearance, an entry, carefully written in Latin, caught everyone's attention. What remains hidden here isn't folklore, it's heritage, and our timing was off. In Rome, rumours started to spread among archivists and scholars, not just about the Ark, but about why no one could enter that chapel. Some were convinced that crossing that threshold without sacred permission would lead to death. Others insisted that the Ark gave off a kind of glow, invisible to human eyes, but noticeable in one's bones. A story quietly shared among Ethiopian clergy tells of a young apprentice who once tried to peek through a crack in the chapel's entrance. He never spoke another word for the rest of his years. The unexpected twist came in 2005 when a new guardian was chosen. As was the custom, the previous one passed away shortly after the succession. As if the weight of guarding the Ark completely drained a man's very essence. The Vatican sent a letter of sympathy, but they also included a proposal for communication. That letter got no reply. Whatever exists inside that cathedral remains unverified by any modern institution. But maybe that's the point. Not all truth is meant for everyone to see. Some things need to stay locked away, not because they're made up, but because they're too powerful to handle. Beneath the golden shine of St. Peter's Basilica, deep within the smooth marble surfaces and echoing choir sections, there's a system of rooms rarely seen by anyone. These spaces aren't filled with books or old papers, but with objects, hundreds of them. Bones, shrouds, thorns, bits of wood, cloth, glass, and rock. Each one is kept in a container, locked behind bronze doors, marked in Latin and protected in silence. These are the Vatican's sacred relics, and they serve a purpose beyond just remembering. They show power. From the very beginning of Christianity, Rome has gathered the sacred pieces of saints and those who witnessed the faith. A finger bone of Thomas, a strand of Mary's hair, a piece of the manger where Christ was said to have rested. These relics are believed to carry a divine presence, a holy power that still brings about miracles. Travellers go thousands of miles just to see them. But what most people don't understand is how strictly they are guarded, not just out of devotion, but for control. A relic isn't just an old object from history, it's a statement. It declares, this belongs to us. And from the Church's point of view, owning a holy object means owning a piece of the story. This focus grew stronger during the Crusades, when warriors travelled to the Holy Land. They came back with pieces of execution tools, cloths stained with old marks, and rocks from the hillsides of Golgotha. Some were real, others were not, but being accurate mattered less than what it symbolised. Rome became the centre not just of faith, but of ownership. Then came a quiet challenge from the east. In the highlands of Ethiopia there were relics untouched by any pope, documents older than Rome, holy images never seen by Western observers, and perhaps most troubling of all, the Ark of the Covenant. If that Ark was real, and if it truly was in Aksum, then Rome's entire collection would be second best. No relic within the Vatican walls could compare to the container that once held the voice of God. That worry wasn't said out loud, but in private rooms, meetings were held, letters were sent, representatives were deployed. In a secret document from 1954, a cardinal worried that Ethiopia's relics had a story that came before ours. That sentence was underlined twice. The truth came out when a secret group travelled to Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie. Their stated purpose was for diplomatic relations. Their real job was to document the relics. They came back empty-handed. However, their expressions showed something different. One member left the priesthood shortly after. Now, Rome's collection remains full, but something has changed. It's said that among the oldest containers hidden on the bottom shelf of the most protected room is an empty vessel. No marks, no identification, just a single inscription carved in Latin, so old that the letters are starting to fade. Acquired before our arrival, never returned. In the spring of 1947, an unknown Vatican official boarded a ship from Naples using a fake identity. He didn't wear any papal symbols. No Swiss guard was with him. No reporters followed his journey. This person was Albino Luciani, a future pope, though no one would have guessed it then. His mission was quiet, unnoticed, and undocumented. An unofficial trip to Africa that would disappear from church records for more than 3 decades. The journey took him through Eritrea, then into the highlands of Ethiopia. He travelled by train, then on foot, speaking little, constantly writing in a leather diary he kept close to his body. When he reached Axum, he stopped, not as a spiritual authority, but as a humble visitor in awe. The legends had reached Rome long before him. Stories of the Ark, hidden monasteries, sacred texts untouched by Latin influence. Yet nothing had prepared him for what he found. Inside a stone church near the remains of the ancient palace, he was shown a collection of illustrated manuscripts. The priest guiding him spoke perfect Italian but offered no explanations. Just page after page of ancient Ge'ez script filled with pictures of heavenly beings, fallen ones, and dark-robed individuals kneeling in flames. Luciani wrote in his diary, "The devotion here comes before memory and carries twice the silence." One evening he was asked to join an elderly monk who had served the church for over 70 years. They talked by firelight, and though Luciani couldn't understand the monk's language, he felt something pass between them, a recognition not of words, but of deep respect. He returned to Rome 14 days later, quietly, with no official announcement. However, his personal records show something more. Hidden in the back of his diary is a single sentence written in Latin and circled 3 times. They never needed our presence, and this represents the real threat. When Luciani became Pope John Paul V in 1978, he lasted only 33 days before his unexpected death. No autopsy was performed. The stated cause was heart failure. However, rumours have continued ever since. Some claim he had planned to reveal certain documents about the Ethiopian Church. Others think he had started to create a new plan for interfaith relations, one that saw Ethiopia not as a younger branch of Rome, but as its equal. The mystery lies in the censored file titled Eastern Missions 47. The folder contains torn-out pages, missing letters, and a photo with burned edges where a young Luciani stands outside the tablet chapel, looking not at the building but at the sky. What he saw there, no one can say. However, deep in the Vatican archives, an old employee once claimed to have heard Luciani's voice on a recording. The tape was almost silent, except for 6 quiet words. Certain relics are not meant to return. In the late 1930s, under the shadow of war and empire, the Vatican sent out a subtle message. It wasn't written down in any formal letters. It didn't go through official channels. Instead, it spread through whispers, from Rome to Addis Ababa, carried by people not wearing religious robes, but military uniforms. Their goal was simple in words, but impossible to achieve in reality. Bring the Ark to Rome. The plan had been made years earlier, during Mussolini's Ethiopian attack. As Italian troops flooded the nation, taking over settlements and valuables, certain people within the Vatican saw an opportunity. If the Ark of the Covenant truly existed, if it wasn't just a myth but a real object, it had to be brought to the centre of Christianity, not for study, they declared, but for safekeeping in private discussions. Others used a different word, acquisition. The idea wasn't to sneak it away, but to move it under the guise of rescue. A document now hidden in the Vatican archives was titled Operation Exodus. It described a plan to take the Ark, disguised as a religious ceremony, claiming it had been given willingly. The Ethiopian church would be told it was temporary, an act of unity, a holy exchange between faithful brothers. However, the monks of Axum didn't trust exchanges, and they didn't forget the previous time Rome had claimed something under the banner of unity. When Italian troops approached the tablet chapel in 1937, the guardian stood alone at the entrance, holding only a wooden cross. He didn't speak. He stood still. The troops, confused, contacted headquarters for instructions. They were ordered to hold their position. However, as night fell, things changed. One soldier, years later, admitted in an unsent letter. He wrote that as dusk came, the chapel began to glow, not with flames, but with a faint light that seemed to move like breath. The birds stopped singing, the air grew heavy, and from behind the chapel's barriers came what he called a noise without sound, a silence so deep it hurt. They left the entrance undisturbed. Rome never acknowledged the operation. The name Operation Exodus was removed from all official records. However, in 1962, during the Second Vatican Council, an Ethiopian bishop had an unusually long private meeting with the Pope. No notes were taken, no summary was written, yet after this, the Pope cancelled a planned trip to Jerusalem. Instead, he asked to walk through the archive halls alone. The Ark never reached Rome. It remains in Axum, untouched, unseen, unclaimed. However, the effort left an impression, a memory buried in the silence between two religious institutions. Some suggest that failure changed the Vatican, reminding Rome's highest authorities that not all holy things belong to them. Certain mysteries are not meant to be understood, and the most precious treasures are those that resist capture. There's a room beneath the Vatican Library where time seems to stand still. The light is dim, filtering through thick glass sections set into the ceiling. The walls are covered with bookshelves, some empty, others holding old containers tied with string. And in one section, beyond a steel barrier with no official access key, sits a volume no one should know about. It's not on any inventory, not even the secret ones. Archivists call it the Red Book, even though it's not bound in bright scarlet, but in a deep, almost black leather. The spine is worn, the pages are thick, the writing is in Ge'ez, a writing system that the average Vatican expert can't read. There's no title, no author. Just a single symbol burned into the cover, a winged being with three faces looking in different directions. The first time this volume arrived in Rome, it caused a stir. It was 1929. It came in a delivery of texts saved from a monastery during territorial conflicts in Ethiopia. Most were sent to the translation rooms, but this one was singled out almost immediately. A young Jesuit researcher opened it and passed out before finishing the second page. He never explained why. The volume was moved to a restricted storage area marked Awaiting Interpretation. It was never handled again, at least not officially. However, over the decades, rumours started to spread among the Vatican's most trusted scribes. They spoke of the volume that didn't age. One archivist insisted he had seen a page turn by itself. Another, after staying alone in the room too long, left the church without explanation and retired to his mountain village in the Alps. He never entered a library again. In the 1950s, a scholar tried to catalogue the volume. He gave it a temporary ID and started to fill out the registration document. However, each time he wrote its designation, the ink faded. He tried again with another writing tool, then with a graphite pencil, then with calcium carbonate. The page remained blank. The document was submitted anyway, empty but sealed, stored in the back of the archive. That lock was later found broken. Although the registration room remained permanently locked, no one confessed to accessing it. Recently, speculation has emerged that the volume contains an alternative version of the Book of Enoch, one that connects the story of the Watchers with predictions missing from any recognised scripture. Some think it talks about 3 hidden arks placed in separate territories, each holding a piece of heavenly flame. Others claim it identifies popes, monarchs, and saints with birth dates, death dates, and something more peculiar. Reappearance now. If you ask any Vatican official about the volume, they'll tell you it doesn't exist. However, occasionally, during the quiet midnight hours, the guard on duty swears he hears the pages turning in the dark, even with no one present. It was found inside a cloth container hidden behind a compartment in a Vatican archivist's office, one that hadn't been opened since his death in 1968. This individual, Brother Matteo Ferrani, was private, careful, and known for arranging the most sensitive documents with precision. He rarely spoke during meals. He spent long periods in the deepest part of the archive. And then, one morning, he didn't show up for work. His heart had stopped in his sleep, or so they said. The key was found by his replacement. It was tiny, cold to the touch, made of a dark metal that didn't match anything else in the archive. The ridges were unusual, too thin, too many. No archivist could identify the mechanism it operated. It had no identifier, no designation. It didn't match any known entry. Yet the Vatican kept it. A file was opened, like all oddities found. However, it quickly became sparse. No designer identified the key's construction. No locksmith could duplicate it. It was placed in a sealed package and moved to a compartment labelled undesignated. Over time, it became a kind of quiet joke among the scribes. The key to absence, the key to the kingdom, the key to an entrance the church misplaced. However then, in the spring of 1983, something strange happened. A visiting Ethiopian scholar invited to examine Ge'ez scrolls was shown the key during a tour. He didn't laugh. Instead, he turned pale. He asked to sit down, and after a long pause, he shared something that silenced the entire room. He had seen a similar entrance before, not in Rome, but in a hidden monastery near the Eritrean border. He claimed the key was shaped like the ancient sun cross used in pre-Christian shrines. And at the monastery he visited as a young man, there was a stone portal, sealed for centuries, with no handle, just a thin slot shaped like that same symbol. When he tried to explain more, the visit was cut short. That night, his lodging was found empty. He left behind his belongings and travel documents. No report was filed, no evidence was ever found. In the years since, the key has been moved twice. First to a restricted cabinet in the papal living quarters, then again to a wall safe inside the archives behind a picture of a deceased pope whose identity is no longer mentioned. Some think it's just a strange thing. Others think it opens something not made by human hands. Some whispers suggest that somewhere beneath the Vatican, deeper than the burial passages, beyond the tombs, there's a sealed room with no documents, no light and no oxygen. A nameless entry waiting for a key, and a secret the church should not have accessed. In the winter of 1937, Pope Pius IV sat isolated in his study, surrounded by unopened mail and African maps. Beyond, Rome was buzzing. The Italian army had advanced into Ethiopia, and the Holy See had gained information not only about the conflict, but about relics, texts, and churches no Western observer had ever seen before. Among the documents on the Pope's desk that night was a file tied with twine, labelled Critical Eyes exclusively. It came from a Jesuit contact located near Lake Tana. Inside were drawings, journal passages, and a translated excerpt from a manuscript discovered in the deep hills of Ethiopia. The text, written in Ge'ez, described a prediction about a lost gospel, a dark lion, and a city of rock hidden underground. One phrase was highlighted in red. When Rome contacts what it cannot comprehend, the flame will emerge. Pope Pius X examined the phrase 3 times. Then he ordered the entry sealed. He was a man of strict observance, an academic at heart. And while he believed in understanding, he also feared what it might destroy. The Vatican had accumulated secrets for centuries, some too dangerous to be spoken. This was not legend. These were not whispers passed down through generations. This discovery threatened to rewrite the foundations of Christian history. What struck him was not the revelation itself, but where it came from. The ancient parchment had been verified beyond a shadow of a doubt. The ink's composition matched techniques from before the time of Christ. The parchment showed deterioration patterns typical of 2 millennia-old documents, and the translation cross, examined by 3 independent experts, left no room for interpretation. It described not a Messiah descended from David's lineage, but born from the union of Solomon with the Queen of Sheba. It placed the Ark not in the heart of Jerusalem, but in the sacred places of Axum. It revealed a church founded not on Peter's remains, but on a covenant forged in the African highlands. That same night, the Pope gave a verbal order to his inner circle. Seal the Ethiopian records, move the parchment to a secure vault, block any investigation into Ethiopian sacred texts, visions and objects, unless directly authorized by the Holy Office. The next morning, a directive circulated through the Vatican archives. A new classification protocol emerged. Ethiopian materials received special security, assigned a new designation, Index Sanctus Obscura, the record of hidden sacred matters. Decades later, when Pope Pius XII died under mysterious circumstances in 1939, his private records were examined. However, the Ethiopian file had vanished. Only his handwritten message survived, pressed between the pages of his Bible. What we suppress now might erupt into chaos later. Yet, may the Church escape that judgment. No pontiff has ever revoked his ban, and the documents remain sealed. She answered only to Ababa, a word meaning flower in the ancient Ethiopian language. A healer, a prophetess, and someone believed to communicate with celestial beings. Her existence unfolded on the green slopes surrounding Lake Tana in the late 18th century. The local clergy considered her sanctified. Villagers swore she brought corpses back to life, and temporarily, even Rome contemplated her canonization. Her story initially reached the Vatican through Jesuit correspondence dated 1821. Carried by a messenger across wilderness and ocean, the letter described Ababa's revelations, her miraculous healings, and her ability to quote entire biblical sections, including passages absent from any scripture authorized by Rome. She spoke in Ge'ez, but when put into writing, her statements reflected fragments of ancient Christian writings missing since the 2nd century. That factor alone caught the Church's attention. A Vatican representative, Father Lorenzo de Monti, was ordered to examine the claims. He entered Ethiopia disguised as a pilgrim, accompanied by a translator and a recorder. His discovery was not deceit or blasphemy, but a serene woman living in a stone chamber surrounded by flickering lights, ancient manuscripts, and stillness. She claimed no authority, held no rank, yet neighbours travelled long distances just to kneel in her presence. Father Lorenzo documented his encounter in a leather journal now buried in the Vatican basements. There, he described her as demonstrating a spiritual luminosity unmatched by any sister or visionary I have seen. He personally observed what he called a restoration beyond all comprehension. When Ababa placed her palms on a dying infant, the child's eyes immediately opened, and he said, "The burning is gone." What alarmed the Vatican, however, was not her holiness. It was her understanding. Ababa freely discussed her visions about the origins of Christianity. She identified disciples whose identities had been erased from official records. She insisted that the first sacrificial table erected after Christ's crucifixion was not in Rome, but in Axum. And she mentioned a dark volume buried under a collapsed monastery, bound with precious metals, protected by a mission. The Vatican's uncertainty deepened. In 1824, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints began its process, but it was never completed. Documents disappeared, a witness recanted, and Father Lorenzo, after returning to the Vatican, became unexpectedly ill. He died before his final testimony could be presented. Only one page remained, found years later, hidden inside his travel bag. On it, a personal note read, "It came too close to reality, unsuitable for our time, premature." Ababa's identity was erased from the canonization files. However, in the mountains of Ethiopia, her legacy lives on. Her burial place continues to attract those seeking restoration. Her chamber is preserved, and every year, on the anniversary of her death, the bells of a modest stone shrine ring. Without human touch on the rope, the Vatican no longer speaks her name. Yet, in the dark corners of history, she remains the saint who almost ascended. His identity was Brother Matthias, a modest figure with a modest role. For over 3 decades, he worked within the Vatican's Archivium Secretum, the private papal library, where admission was strictly restricted and understanding its true depths was even rarer. His responsibility seemed simple: preserve the organization of restricted collections, regulate environmental conditions for ancient documents, and catalogue any newly forbidden texts. He never questioned the classifications, and no one questioned him. However, in the last years of his service, Brother Matthias began to describe visions in his sleep. At first, he only confided in the night guard. Then the janitor dreams of nameless peaks, celestial bodies burning blue, and speaks in an unknown language that he nevertheless understood. He would wake with syllables on his lips that resembled storm and gale, and repeatedly the same identical revelation resonated in his consciousness. The flame exists within the earth. One dawn in the winter of 1978, Matthias appeared late. His gaze seemed bloodshot, his limbs trembled. He informed the chief archivist that he needed access to Vault C, among the oldest and most protected chambers under Vatican territory. That single request raised concern. Vault C contained materials related to early Christian movements considered threatening, heretical, or simply too peculiar to be included in the Church's narrative. Inside that room lay a crimson leather codex, long abandoned, its pages too delicate for reproduction. Its origin dated back to a monastery in northern Ethiopia. It bore no title, no creator, only symbols engraved in both Ge'ez and an older language, one that Vatican linguists never fully deciphered. The volume had remained untouched for almost a century until that moment, when Brother Matthias accessed it without authorization. Subsequently, he would claim to have felt compelled to do so. He informed the supervising cardinal that the voice from his dream had guided him to the hidden text between the lines. "Beyond mere ink," he murmured, "but enlightenment, there is communication in the burning of the page." The cardinal dismissed him. The volume was sealed again. Matthias was removed from his post and quietly retired. But 3 weeks later, another episode occurred. Guards found him prostrate in the middle of St. Peter's Square, barefoot, clothes in tatters, vocalizing in Ge'ez. Though no one understood how he had acquired it, he repeated the same phrase over and over: "The volume has not disappeared. The earth holds the memory." He vanished the next morning. No trace, no correspondence, not even a goodbye to his fellow monks. The Vatican issued no statement. His identity was quietly removed from the official record of Vatican personnel. However, in the record of Alt C, still preserved in ink on parchment, his mark persists, a single entry, dated and engraved in uncertain handwriting. Matthias for illumination under the rock. No one has accessed the volume since. In the remote corners of a stone sanctuary nestled deep in the Ethiopian highlands, a plea is uttered not to a distant deity, but to one who walked the planet with bare feet and fiery breath. For the Ethiopian Church, Christ exists not only as celestial, but as living tissue enigma contained in the epidermis, not symbolism. This concept, though primordial, caused tremors in the Vatican halls long before Rome's formal assemblies determined what could and could not be proclaimed about the essence of Christ. Ethiopian believers maintained their distinct perspective. They accepted that God had not merely assumed the appearance, but had transformed into appearance, not representation, not disguise, but humanity in its entirety. Bone, circulation, and essence unified. It was a belief passed down not through dogma, but through melody, through narrative, through the fragrance of incense rising through carved stone halls. For the Western institution, this perspective troubled them. Between the 4th and 5th centuries, theological disputes flared, assemblies met, arguments escalated. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 pronounced a rigid stance. Christ embodied both complete divinity and complete humanity, two natures without mixture. However, the Ethiopian Church abstained from that assembly. They clung to their perpetual belief that Christ's celestial and mortal essence were singular, inseparable, not just united, but indistinct. Rome called it a deviation. Vatican theologians documented the assessments. They classified Ethiopian theology as monophysite, terminology used to identify and segregate. However, those familiar with Ethiopian monasteries recognized the opposite. Their discovery was not deviation, but an enigma too profound for neat categorizations. One such theologian, Father Emilianus, visited the monastery of Debridamo in 1927. He left there with a sculpted representation of Christ, unlike any other he had encountered. The gaze was tender but dark, the complexion warm and earthy, the clothing of unknown design. He did not look Roman, Emilianus noted in his diary, but like the humanity of the territory, and yet I couldn't look away. What most disturbed the Vatican was not the representation, but the authority behind it. These were not false images. They were living doctrines born not from assemblies, but from connections, passed from elder to descendant, from cleric to youth, through tales too ancient to be traced. A Vatican administrator, after examining Emilianus's findings, drafted a confidential memo. Their Christ is different from ours. He does not submit to Rome. That phrase was never meant to be visible beyond the archives, yet a copy survived, inserted in the back of a careless report. It now rests in a compartment, yellowed with time, its meaning still penetrating. Because in Ethiopian devotion there exists an interrogation that the Vatican has never fully resolved. What if the enigma of Christ was not in understanding him, but in abandoning attempts to define him completely? On the golden slopes of northern Ethiopia, long before amplification and marble shrines, there existed a murmur that became belief, and that belief became narrative. It was the narrative of a Christ who was not dual, but triple. Not merely mortal and celestial, as the Church of Rome had meticulously proclaimed, but something older and more enigmatic. Celestial, mortal, and ethereal, intertwined in a way that could not be separated. For the Ethiopian monks, this concept was not new. It permeated their hymns, shaped their crosses, hidden between the lines of their ancient Ge'ez manuscripts. It was not insurrection, it was veneration, an enigma too vast for Rome's classifications. However, in the Vatican, this silent belief sparked apprehension. During the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Church of Rome had permanently secured the doctrine. Christ possessed two natures, not one, not three. It was established as law. To affirm otherwise meant deviation. However, Ethiopia missed that assembly. They preserved their tradition intact, their individual sacred writings unaltered. And within those writings existed the concept that Christ contained a third dimension, not only celestial and mortal, but a Holy Spirit that travelled between, beyond, and within. A young Jesuit theologian named Aurelius de Santi was among the first to document this belief after a secret expedition to Ethiopia in 1924. His observations, never published but filed in the Vatican's restricted records, mention a dialogue with a monk on the border of Lake Tana. The monk had met his gaze and stated, "To understand Christ, you must find him not as two halves, but as a complete enigma." That phrase haunted de Santi. In his private diary, he admitted bewilderment, even terror. "Their faith is not fragmented," he wrote. "It surpasses ours in depth, and yet it differs from ours." De Santi's account triggered a subtle warning in the Vatican. The concept of a third dimension, an ethereal dimension, did not fit Western doctrine. It meant something alive, something breathing, something changing, something uncontrollable. The Vatican feared what this could unleash. Soon after, a memo went around to the older cardinals. It warned against a growing curiosity about Ethiopian writings and argued for limits on any research into the supposed deviation of the three natures. The name stuck, even though no Ethiopian clergy ever used it. And yet, really, the idea was never about deviation. It was about wonder, a different way of seeing Christ, not through rules and laws, but through mystery, song, and quietness. And even though the Vatican hid those documents, the story still lives on in carved shrines, in whispered prayers, and in hidden manuscripts, where sunlight only shines once a year. And so the search continues, gentle but strong. What if the truth the Vatican feared wasn't wrong, but just unknown? In a small shrine behind the tall stone walls of the Ethiopian College in Rome, there once was a painting no one talked about. It wasn't in any tourist guides. Visitors never saw the room. Most priests even walked past it without knowing. But those who did see it never forgot it. The painting was special, not because of its size, but because of its stillness. It showed Christ sitting on a carved wooden throne, his feet resting on a cloud pillow. Around him, a golden glow flickered through delicate brushstrokes. But it wasn't the throne, or the gold, or even the clouds that made people uneasy. It was his face. Christ was shown as a black man, his skin a rich brown, his eyes wide and calm, his hair tightly curled, his posture neither angry nor kind, but still as if waiting. The artist had captured something ancient, something grand and human at the same time. The painting is thought to have been made in the early 1600s, brought from Axum to Rome by an Ethiopian church leader named Father Tekla Hymenot. He carried it in a wooden box wrapped in cloth and faith. At first it was respectfully placed in the small shrine, but decades later, after a change in popes, it was quietly removed. No reason was ever given. The Vatican never openly criticised the painting. There were no official statements, no public orders. But behind closed doors, rumours spread. Some whispered that the painting was too challenging, that it brought up questions the Church wasn't ready to face. Because if Christ had been seen and honoured as black by entire Christian nations for centuries, what did that mean for the story Western Europe had created? What did it mean for the paintings that lined the halls of St. Peter's Basilica, for the pale marble statues, for the history that had shaped empires and justified power? It's said that in 1942, during the chaos of war, the painting was completely removed. A Vatican librarian later wrote in a diary, marked confidential, that it had been moved to a storage area under the secret archives. Not destroyed, just hidden. But not all stories stay hidden. In the early 2000s, a photograph appeared, just one of the painting. A theologian claimed it had been taken in the 1970s by a visiting Ethiopian monk. The Vatican never said it was real, but those who had seen the original said the photo was true. The same face, the same look. And so the mystery continues. Was the idea of Christ as a black man too different? Or just too accurate? Maybe the biggest fear wasn't the painting itself, but the quietness that followed it, the questions it asked without words, and the history it held for all to see. In a city built on holy tradition, sometimes the most powerful truths are hidden not in darkness, but in plain sight, behind a locked door. The flame was small, but the documents burned quickly. It happened late at night in the garden behind the Apostolic Palace. A servant holding the flame was told to look away. A cardinal watched silently. And the person who gave the order? He stood with his hands together, his face pale in the moonlight. It was the Pope. Not all Vatican mysteries are buried underground, some turn to ash. The document in question wasn't long, less than 50 pages, bound in rough leather, the writing etched in careful script. But what it claimed, what it dared to claim, made it threatening. It spoke of visions, of predictions, and of a belief system that didn't match what Rome had declared holy. It described a Christ not just seen in human form, but one who travelled among the poor in Ethiopia, who spoke in the ancient Ge'ez language, and who named as holy those never recognised in the Western world. The Pope who ordered its destruction wasn't known for anger. He was a quiet, thoughtful, private person. But something in the writing must have troubled him. Some say it was a part that claimed the Church had chosen the wrong path 1,000 years earlier. Others believe it was an identity, a long-forgotten Ethiopian monk whose teachings were more like those of the first apostles than anything in the Roman rules. Whatever it was, it crossed a line. Not just the line of difference, but something deeper, something older, a challenge to the very foundation of control. The flame ate up the book in less than 10 minutes, but not completely. Without the Pope knowing, one of the Vatican archivists had made a copy, written by hand, page by page. He hadn't done it out of rebellion, but out of respect. He believed the words were sacred. He believed they shouldn't be ignored. He hid the copy in a container of manuscripts, keeping it safe behind a hidden section in a small shrine outside the city. That shrine isn't used anymore. It was closed in the 1950s, after lightning damaged the roof. But the section, they say, is still there. What scared the Pope wasn't the flame, or even the fear of it being revealed. It was what the book made possible. A different story, a different Christ. A church not centred in Rome, but in the highlands of Africa, where cave shrines held voices that didn't echo the Vatican's teachings. In the Vatican, quiet can be louder than bells, and when something burns, it's not always erased. Sometimes the flame is just the start of the story. It was small, no bigger than a serving dish, encased in dark wood and wrapped in cloth. It arrived at the Vatican quietly, like many relics. There was no parade, no announcement, just a lone monk from the highlands of Ethiopia who walked the last part barefoot, carrying the painting as if it were alive. He spoke in very little Latin, just enough to say, "This belongs to both of us now." The painting showed the Virgin and Child, but not in the usual European way. The skin was dark, the eyes deep and almond-shaped, and the clothes rich in colour. Gold, scarlet, and blue. The child Jesus held a manuscript, not a cross, and in the distance were blurry hills that didn't look like Bethlehem. They looked like the peaks of northern Ethiopia. It was hung in a side chapel near the back of the basilica. At first, few noticed it. There were no signs, no words. Just a painting placed among the bright artworks, left to be found by wandering pilgrims and silent priests. But within a month, whispers began. A caretaker was the first to write it down. He claimed the gaze moved, not suddenly, not like a ghost, but slowly, as if following those who came too close. Then came the clergy, who found drops on the surface below, small, clear, and sticky, like tears. They wiped them away. But the next morning they reappeared. A group of theologians was called. They checked the wrapping, the paints, the outside. Nothing unusual, no tricks, no strange substances. The cloth behind the painting was clean and dry, but the wetness kept coming back. One evening, during a quiet mass, a nun sitting in the second row was startled. The painting, she said, had cried right in front of her eyes. She saw it, didn't imagine it, didn't dream it. Tears ran down the Virgin's face and disappeared before touching the wrapping. That night, the painting was removed, not destroyed, not sent back. It was hidden. No official statement was made, no mention in the archives. But a guard assigned to the papal residence that night heard a heated conversation behind a locked door. The Pope wasn't angry, he was terrified. "If word gets out," he said, "we will lose our centre." The painting was believed to have come from a monastery founded in the 5th century. It had hung over an altar where pilgrims prayed in Ge'ez, the ancient language the Vatican could never fully control. And the manuscript in the child's hand, according to the monk, wasn't from the Gospel of Luke or Matthew. It was from the Book of Enoch, a book Rome had put away. The Vatican keeps many things behind locked doors, but this painting, small and unnoticed, left a lasting impact that has never faded. Some say it still cries today behind the stone, in the quiet place where faith and fear meet. In the spring of 1935, dark clouds hung over Africa, and Rome watched silently. At the centre of that quietness stood two powerful men. One wore white robes and spoke only in public blessings. The other wore a black uniform, spoke from platforms, and promised to bring back an empire. Pope Pius V and Benito Mussolini were never side by side. But they shared more than just geography. They shared secrets. As Mussolini prepared to attack Ethiopia, the Vatican didn't speak out. There were no public condemnations, no sermons of peace. Instead, there were secret meetings, unrecorded visits between representatives and church leaders, meetings held behind the thick doors of the Apostolic Palace. The attack began in October 1935. Planes dropped poisonous gas. Shrines were destroyed, monasteries burned, but St. Peter's Square remained silent. Not because the Vatican approved of the violence, no, but the Ethiopian way of Christianity, its ancient books, its vast history, its claim to the Ark of the Covenant was seen as a dangerous parallel, too close to Rome, one that had survived without it. A document, later found in the margins of a diplomatic paper, suggests a disturbing reason. A handwritten note next to a typed assessment from a papal advisor reads, "If the libraries burn, we will never have to answer for what we did not teach." That one sentence says a lot. For hundreds of years, the Vatican had guided the course of history through holy writings. But in Ethiopia, those same writings showed something completely different. The Queen of Sheba had travelled to Jerusalem. Her son Menelik took the Ark. The Ethiopian Bible contained books Rome had rejected, and throughout it all their clergy spoke in Ge'ez, a language older than Latin, untouched by European councils. Mussolini sought an empire. The Vatican sought control over the story being told. Their goals crossed paths. But not everyone agreed. A young bishop stationed in Florence began writing letters. In those letters, he challenged the silence coming from Rome. He quoted the book of Isaiah and spoke of coming judgment. His last letter, written in March 1937, came back unopened. Soon after, he was moved to a remote village and never wrote for publication again. Decades later, a Jesuit librarian found a sealed envelope hidden behind a folder in the Vatican archives. Inside was a photograph. It showed Ethiopian monks standing among the ruins of a church, holding pieces of an ancient manuscript. Written at the top, in faded ink, were the words, "They tried to erase us." The Vatican never denied its silence, but it also offered no explanation. That silence remains. In the gardens beyond St. Peter's Basilica, there's a small plaque, worn and easy to miss. It bears no name, only a date, October 3rd, 1935, and a single verse from Scripture. "Woe to those who call evil good," a verse chosen not for the world, but perhaps for the Church itself. In the dim light of the Vatican's archive section, far from the echoing halls of St. Peter's Basilica, there exists a drawer with no official record. Its label is blank. Its key is not held by anyone currently living. And inside, according to stories whispered by old employees, lie the documents of Haile Selassie. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was more than a political figure. He was seen by his people as a holy king, the 225th direct heir of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. To the Vatican, he symbolized something far more threatening, a ruler who held a Christian heritage older than Rome itself. When the Italian occupation of Ethiopia ended in 1936, Selassie was forced into exile. But during those years away, he spoke more powerfully than ever. In Geneva, before the League of Nations, he stood with royal stillness and then gave a speech that echoed through the halls of the Vatican. He spoke of judgment. He spoke of justice. He called upon God. Not the God of Latin ceremonies, but the ancient God of Ethiopia. It was more than politics. It was prophecy. A priest in charge of diplomatic tracking at the time, Father Leone Marini, kept detailed notes of the speech. His report, sealed as confidential and given directly to the Secretary of State, included an unusual observation. This man does not ask for help. He speaks as if he already knows the outcome. After the fall of Mussolini and Selassie's return to his throne, Rome grew anxious. Vatican representatives were sent under diplomatic cover. Some were told to suggest reconciliation. Others were told simply to observe and monitor. What they found surprised them. Ethiopian scholars held prophecies never translated into Latin. One document, mentioned in a missing Jesuit letter, suggested that a time would come when the Empire of the West would take on the clothes of the East and lose sight of its origins. That letter was never made public, but it was recorded and then locked away. The most disturbing event happened in 1949, when Haile Selassie presented a gift to the Pope, a bound manuscript in Ge'ez, transcribed by desert monks, said to contain visions witnessed by the emperor himself. It was never displayed, never mentioned. But an internal Vatican memo from that year refers to a book of signs given by Ethiopia, now kept in the secret archives. Because of what it contained and where it came from, years passed and the documents remained sealed. In 1975, soon after Selassie's mysterious death while under house arrest, a note was added to the file. It was written in red pencil, the same kind used by senior Vatican librarians. Do not destroy, do not discuss. Await the end of the century. No one knows who wrote that line, and perhaps, even more unsettling, no one has tried to remove it. In the spring of 1936, in the quiet rooms of the Vatican, an unusual stillness settled like dust on the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica. It wasn't the stillness of respect or devotion, but the kind of silence that follows a storm that wasn't expected. That storm didn't come from Rome, but from Geneva, where a man dressed in Ethiopian ceremonial clothes stood alone before the League of Nations. Emperor Haile Selassie, banished from his country by Mussolini's invasion, stood firm before the world's representatives. But his words weren't just for them, they were, according to a Vatican diplomat present, aimed directly at Rome. Not just the government, but the Holy See itself. Selassie's voice, calm and steady, carried a warning that went beyond politics. He spoke of justice, of faith, and of the ancient bond between his people and their God. He didn't beg, he didn't negotiate. Instead, he declared that Ethiopia had kept the faith of Solomon while the West had abandoned it. He reminded everyone there that Ethiopia had accepted Christianity before Rome even claimed the cross. The Vatican had sent Bishop Armand Del Vecchio as a witness. He was a quiet man, known more for figuring out old Syriac writings than for being a diplomat. But what he saw that day would stick with him. In his private report he wrote, "It wasn't a speech, it was scripture." And it really did seem like the words had come from a much older, more sacred time. That night, the Emperor's powerful voice reached the fancy halls of St. Peter's Basilica, even though he'd never stepped foot inside. The priests whispered about the speech. Cardinals talked about it behind closed doors. The Pope's advisors worried it might make people rethink Ethiopia's Christian claims, especially as Rome's own ties with fascist Italy became harder to defend. What bothered them most wasn't just what the speech said, but one sentence that was left out of the official record. A sentence said softly, almost as if meant for ears beyond the room. According to Bishop Del Vecchio, the emperor had ended by saying, "The Lion of Judah still watches from the mountains and its roar has not been forgotten." That phrase, an old hint at both the Solomonic family line and Bible predictions, made some Vatican historians nervous. One wrote in the margin of the document, "If true, we must rethink what we call apostolic." The Pope, after looking at the report, didn't say anything publicly. But 3 days later, access to the Ethiopian section of the Vatican Library was restricted without explanation, and Bishop Del Vecchio was moved to a faraway job in northern Spain, where he never wrote for publication again. The speech, even though many in the world didn't pay attention to it, was never truly ignored inside the Vatican. Its effects still quietly move through the halls, carried not by the wind, but by memory and the fear of a truth that Rome can't control. One summer night in 1936, the lights dimmed in the tunnels beneath Vatican City. The cobblestone ground under St. Peter's Square had seen many secrets pass through it. Bishops with forbidden books, librarians carrying sealed containers, and cardinals with thoughts they could never say out loud. But that night, the quiet was broken by the Swiss guards' boots echoing like a warning along the old stone passage. It was shortly after the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, gave his strong speech in Geneva. Whispers of his words had reached the Holy See like smoke seeping through cracks in a door. Some believed his speech had unsettled more than a few people. Some claimed it had stirred something in the archives below. A guard named Matthias Ulrich, only 22 years old, was stationed at the eastern entrance to the Archivium Secretum. He was new, eager, and curious. And that night, according to a story buried in the guard's records, he saw a man in black robes trying to get into the restricted rooms. The man didn't have permission and didn't say a word, but he was holding something tight in his hand, a small, gold-decorated book wrapped in red cloth. The guard told him to stop. The man didn't listen. Ulrich raised his spear, and then the man disappeared. He didn't turn and run. He didn't slip into a side passage. He vanished as if the shadows themselves had swallowed him. The young guard sounded the alarm. In moments, 4 others responded. A search began. Every passage under the Apostolic Palace was checked, every entrance looked at, but no man was found. Only one item remained, lying on the ground where Ulrich had last seen the figure. A ring made of brass, engraved with a single word in Ge'ez script. No one could make sense of it. What followed was silence. The incident was never officially recorded in Vatican history. But weeks later, 2 things happened. First, Ulrich was removed from his post, transferred without explanation to a faraway church in the hills beyond Milan. Second, a collection of unmarked boxes arrived from the Ethiopian college and was moved without paperwork to a hidden section of the archive. Years later, an old librarian admitted, over wine and candlelight, that the Vatican had long feared not a war of armies, but a war of truths. That night in 1936, he claimed, wasn't about a guard seeing something strange. It was about a door the Vatican thought it had sealed, opening again for good. Even today the Swiss Guard never talks about it. The ring was never catalogued, and the Vatican has never explained why. For 3 days after that night, the doors to the Archivium Secretum stayed closed, guarded by 12 men with loaded rifles, while the bells of St. Peter's remained silent. In a quiet room deep inside the Vatican museums, behind thick glass windows and under the soft glow of gentle white lights, rests an artifact no one should have seen. It's a small gold cross, delicate and unusual, placed at the bottom of a private collection known only to a few chosen curators. According to official papers, it arrived during the chaos of World War II, anonymously given by a European collector. But the story behind it is much older and much more unsettling. The cross doesn't match any Roman or European design. Its arms curve outward like branches, ending in shapes like flames or feathers. On one side is a circle of Amharic writing, on the back a carving of a winged lion. But the most surprising part is what's in the middle. A gem carved into the shape of an eye, red like blood, smooth like glass. It's not from Europe or even the Holy Land. Experts have traced its origin to the Ethiopian highlands near the ancient city of Aksum. The Vatican recognized this symbol. It matched one found in the margin of the Book of Enoch, in a version only kept in Ethiopia. The eye, they decided, stood for divine judgment, the all-seeing eye of the Watchers. For centuries the Church had called these stories heresy, burying and erasing them. And yet, here it was, in gold, on a relic carried across continents and time. But the real mystery began when a scholar tried to study it. In 1973, a young Jesuit historian named Father Leone was allowed a brief look into the restricted room. He spent hours drawing the cross, figuring out what he could. What he wrote down was never fully published, but parts of his diary were leaked by a former student many years later. According to the notes, the writing on the cross had a date much older than the time of Christ, and a phrase that translated to, "The covenant was brought south," brought, not lost. That single phrase caused unease within the archives. If it was accurate, it would mean the cross was connected not just to Ethiopian tradition, but to something more sacred, something Roman Catholicism had long rejected. The implication was clear. The Ark of the Covenant, or a piece of it, had travelled to Ethiopia. And this cross, this strange ancient golden symbol, was its marker. Within days, Father Leone's research was stopped. The cross was put back behind glass. Leone himself was moved to a mission in Argentina and never spoke publicly again. The Vatican called the interpretation unproven and advised silence. But silence has its own weight, and those who have seen the cross in person say that on certain days the gem in its centre seems to glow faintly, as if something inside it remembers, as if it's still watching. In the grand halls of the Vatican, there are some truths never spoken aloud. They aren't written in textbooks, not taught in seminaries, and not whispered among the faithful. One such truth concerns a split. Not the great schism between East and West, not Martin Luther's Reformation, but another separation, one that was never announced, never recorded, and yet quietly changed the course of Christian history. It didn't happen with swords, but with silence, not with fiery sermons. It unfolded in letters never delivered, in visits never revealed, and in agreements that faded in candlelit rooms. This was the split between the Roman Church and the ancient Ethiopian Church, a division so deep and quiet that most people never even realized it happened. Long before Rome solidified its power, Ethiopia practiced its old form of Christianity, rooted in Jewish customs, rich with Jewish traditions, and guided by texts the Vatican would later call apocryphal. The Ethiopian faith thrived in the mountains and deserts, hidden from Roman eyes, and for centuries the Vatican watched, uneasy. In the early 1600s, Jesuits were sent to Ethiopia not just as missionaries, but as enforcers. Their goal was to make the Ethiopian faith match Roman doctrine. They brought gifts, praised kings, and held secret debates with monks in candlelit monasteries. But Ethiopia wouldn't budge. Its priests refused to give up the Book of Enoch. They wouldn't reject Mary's humanity. They wouldn't replace their chants with Latin hymns. When diplomacy failed, silence followed. A letter from a cardinal in 1639, found in a private archive in Avignon, speaks of the great sorrow the Holy See felt over the loss of the brethren in the highlands. But the letter was never officially documented. No excommunication was declared. No public announcement was made. Rome simply stopped mentioning Ethiopia, as if ignoring a wound could heal it. But Ethiopia remembered. In a monastery near Lake Tana, a carved wooden door shows a lion turning its back on a two-headed eagle. The monks say it was made after the last Jesuit left the highlands. The lion, they claim, represents the House of Judah, the eagle the authority of Rome. The carving isn't angry, it's mournful, a quiet goodbye. And yet, hidden in the Vatican archives, there's proof that the separation was never truly forgotten. A restricted folder labelled simply Ethiopia contains references to meetings, translations, and sealed documents. Most were never opened again. Some say a pope once tried to mend the break. Others say the fear of what Ethiopia knew, what books it kept, what truths it refused to erase, was too overwhelming. So the division was never public, but it was real, and it lingers, quiet, like a shadow between two great churches that once shared a beginning but chose different endings. In 1647, under the scorching sun of the Ethiopian highlands, a priest named Father Tesfa stood at the entrance of a stone chapel carved into a mountainside. He wore simple white linen, his cross carved from olive wood. Waiting for him at the edge of the clearing were two men in black, Jesuits from Rome, sent to give him a choice. They came with promises: education, protection, gold, and the Pope's blessing. They carried letters sealed with red wax, signed by cardinals. They said Rome wished to embrace him, to make him a bridge between two churches. All he had to do was give up the old teachings, close the Book of Enoch, and accept the authority of the Holy See. But Father Tesfa didn't move. The men waited. One of them, a young Jesuit with tired eyes, opened a leather-bound book and read aloud from the Roman canon. He quoted verses that had been removed from Ethiopian worship centuries before. Then he read a list, books Rome had forbidden, but Ethiopia still read: Jubilees, the Book of Mary, the story of the Watchers. When the reading ended, Tesfa spoke. He said scripture wasn't a wall, but a well, that water flows from many places, not just Rome. He told them the mountain they stood on had been a place of worship before Latin was spoken, that angels didn't speak only Rome's language, and that God hadn't asked him to choose. The older Jesuit grew angry. He warned Tesfa that defiance was heresy, that his refusal could be seen as rebellion. He reminded him of other priests who had disappeared, of churches that had been quietly shut down. He asked if Tesfa was willing to risk not just his life, but his soul. Tesfa looked out over the valley. Smoke rose from nearby villages where Jesuit missions had already replaced sacred texts. His people were scared, not of war, but of silence, of losing the words that had shaped their prayers for 1,000 years. So he answered, "I was baptized with water from a stone font that sits on an angel's tomb," he said. "I have kissed manuscripts that glow in candlelight and held a cross that bled in the snow. I do not fear the Vatican. I fear forgetting who we are." That night, the Jesuits left without a word. Weeks later, the chapel was found empty. No sign of a struggle, no footprints in the dust. Only a single page left on the altar, the ink still fresh. It read, "Truth does not bend, it waits." To this day, Father Tesfa's name is missing from all Vatican records. But in a monastery far from Rome, his story is still shared, not as a tale of rebellion, but as a reminder. Some priests don't disappear. Some simply walk deeper into the mystery and leave the door open behind them. Along the quiet northern wall of the Vatican, hidden just behind the colonnades of St. Peter's Square, stands a building most visitors pass without a second glance. Its stone walls are warmed by the Roman sun, its windows are always closed, and its doors never open to tourists. This is the Pontifical Ethiopian College, the spiritual home for a handful of Ethiopian priests who have studied within the Vatican walls for centuries. But beneath its chapel, hidden under layers of stone and silence, is a chamber that appears on no official map. The chamber wasn't always a secret. In the late 1800s, when the college was just being expanded, workmen discovered a narrow staircase sealed with a wooden door. The priest overseeing the construction, a man named Abba Johannes, told them not to open it until he consulted the Vatican library. But by morning the workmen had vanished. Not fired, just gone. No record, no forwarding address, not even a paycheck left behind. Years later, a young student named Daniel was assigned to sweep the lower crypts. It was a punishment for speaking openly about books not approved for his studies, including the Kebra Nagast and the Book of Enoch. As he dusted the rough stones, he noticed a hollow sound under one of the floor slabs. When he lifted it, he found a rusty key tied to a leather cord. The tag read, "Only an Abba." He took the key to his instructor, who stared at it for a long time before silently leading him to a hidden door behind a tapestry of St. Frumentius. The lock clicked once. The door creaked open, and what lay beyond wasn't a storage room. It was a library, small, round, and dug into the earth itself. The chamber was lined with wooden shelves built into the stone. On them rested scrolls, some too fragile to touch, others rolled tight in animal skin. There were books bound in palm leaves and written in languages that had long since disappeared. In the centre, under a single shaft of light from a hole in the ceiling, stood a wooden desk. On it, open and exposed to the air, lay a manuscript no one could date. The ink was a dark red. The letters were not Ge'ez or Latin. Some believed it had been written before the fall of Axum. Others said it was a translation of a scroll taken from Jerusalem before the Roman siege. Daniel was never seen again. When the door was opened years later, the manuscript was gone. But carved into the stone above the desk, someone had etched 7 words. They buried the light so it would burn. The Vatican has never acknowledged the chamber's existence, but those who live within the college sometimes speak of dreams, of voices echoing from beneath the ground, whispering in a language no one remembers. And yet, everyone understands. In a quiet reading room deep within the Vatican Library, where the air always smells faintly of parchment and old incense, lies a book unlike any other. It's kept in a locked drawer inside a simple wooden desk, far from the gilded halls and polished marble most visitors imagine. Its cover is worn, its pages crumbling at the edges. And yet what it contains has kept scholars awake for generations. The text isn't in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or even the ancient Ge'ez language. The symbols flow across the page like music, not letters. Some look like stars, others like flames, and between them faint lines suggest movement, as if the writing breathes. The book has no title, no known author, and no record of how it came to be within the Vatican walls. A single handwritten note tucked between its pages suggests it was composed in the language of celestial beings. This single claim has caused endless arguments. During the 17th century, a very eager Jesuit priest named Father Niccolo Rinaldi found the book while organising uncatalogued texts. Nothing there looked familiar, and yet the ink itself seemed unsettling. As he brought each page closer to the flame, he noticed the characters shimmer for an instant, only visible out of the corner of his eye. He presented the manuscript to his superior, who dismissed it as nothing more than a regional forgery. Rinaldi couldn't shake his fascination. Week after week he worked under lamplight, trying to copy the strange symbols onto new parchment. He was convinced, however crazy it sounded, that the angelic language had to follow mathematical rules. He looked at patterns, counted shapes, and even said prayers over the text. Then one night, everything changed. At dawn, Rinaldi was found passed out on the marble floor of the study. He was still alive, but he couldn't speak. Black ink stained his fingers, and he clutched a torn piece of paper to his body. On it were only 3 words, written in neat, scared handwriting. "They answered me." He never wrote again. The Vatican immediately took the manuscript. Rumours say it was locked away under St. Peter's Basilica. Other stories claim it was moved to the Apostolic Archive, buried deep inside, where even high-ranking church officials need special permission to see it. Only a few code breakers have looked at it since, and none have figured out even one sentence. And yet, a puzzle remains. Vatican records show that the manuscript's ink doesn't come from any known source. No animal, no plant, no rock. It has no iron, no colour, no carbon leftovers. Under UV light, it glows softly like moonlight on water. Some people think the text wasn't written but spoken into existence, that it didn't come from a prophet but from something heard in the dark, a language not meant for reading but for experiencing. And those who experience it are changed forever. On a spring afternoon in 1954, a strange quiet fell over Vatican City. It wasn't the quiet of peace or prayer, but the kind that happens when something is wrong. The steady broadcast from Vatican Radio, known for its beautiful Latin hymns and distant church bells, suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. The priest broadcasting, Father Leone Ricci, never finished his thought. For almost 10 seconds, only static filled the air. Then a sound came that no one could identify. Those who heard it at that exact moment described it as a deep hum that rose to a high-pitched whistle. It spread across the airwaves like wind whistling through a narrow passage, and yet beneath it something even stranger emerged. A voice, or something like it. Not in Italian, not in Latin, certainly not a known language. The sound was soft, almost a whisper, but complex, as if many voices were speaking at once, as if someone or something was trying to break through. Father Ricci didn't broadcast again that night. In fact, he disappeared completely. The official explanation was a simple technical problem. Vatican technicians released a public statement the next day, saying a blown fuse in the station's broadcast tower had caused interference with nearby frequencies. And yet, many amateur radio operators outside Rome insisted they had heard the event. One of them, a former technician named Giorgio Vanni, gave his tape recording to a university professor in Milan. The professor, an expert in early Semitic languages, listened carefully. After a long silence, he stood up and left without saying a word. He refused to give more details, though later that year he published a short paper discussing non-linear vocal structures found in ancient East African ceremonies. In private, Giorgio claimed the voice had continuously repeated one phrase. He suspected it was Ge'ez, the ancient sacred language still used by the Ethiopian church. Although he couldn't understand it, one term came up repeatedly: Menelik. The Vatican never acknowledged the rumours, and yet, a week after the broadcast, 2 Jesuit representatives were sent to Ethiopia on a diplomatic mission. Their task was never officially recorded, and Father Ricci, the priest who disappeared during the broadcast, was never found. Some say he entered the Apostolic Library days before the incident, carrying a container of newly delivered documents from East Africa. Others believe he was looking at forbidden texts related to the Kebra Nagast and may have found a connection the Church preferred to keep hidden. The Vatican broadcast tower has never had such an interruption since. And yet, sometimes, on the anniversary of that night, amateur radio operators tune to the same frequency and listen carefully. Sometimes when conditions are right, they insist. The hum returns. Not strong, not clear, but present enough to make you wonder who or what was trying to communicate in that silence. Beneath Rome, far below the busy streets and bright rooms of Vatican City, lies a vast network of tomb-like tunnels, shadowy passages, and narrow dugout spaces from centuries ago. Long before the grand churches and marble seats of the popes, these served as safe places for early followers of Christ, hidden tombs and altars away from the emperor's eye. However, one of these passages hides a puzzle far stranger than human remains. In the spring of 1926, a team of Vatican workers was tasked with strengthening a deeper part of the tomb tunnels near the ancient Appian Way. One worker, a quiet man named Pietro De Luca, hit what seemed like a loose section of dirt with his pickaxe. Instead, the barrier crumbled into a narrow enclosed space. The air that came out was thick with centuries and the smell of damp parchment. Inside the space was a stone ledge, and on it a tightly rolled parchment secured with an old crimson thread. Unlike the fragile Latin manuscripts nearby, this parchment was wrapped in layers of cloth that had mysteriously resisted decay. A metal crucifix, unusually shaped and unlike any used in Western Christianity, had been pressed into the wrapping as a seal. Pietro, alarmed, told his supervisor, who then contacted the archivist's office. Within hours, a dark vehicle arrived from the Vatican, and the parchment was removed. Pietro never saw it again. He was reassigned to garden maintenance on Vatican property and quietly retired 2 years later. However, the story didn't end with him. Decades later, in 1973, a scholar named Sister Antonella, who dealt with early church documents, found a single unlisted entry in a leather-bound inventory book within the Apostolic Archive. It described a parchment of unknown origin, called Oriental, impossible to translate, and preserved with mysterious methods. No language was specified, and yet next to the reference were 2 terms, highlighted in faded, fire-resistant ink. Sister Antonella became obsessed with this parchment. She suspected it might be linked to the Abhagarama Gospels, ancient Ethiopian manuscripts supposedly written in a single day by a holy man, guided by heavenly beings. What bothered her was the mention of fire resistance. Throughout history, only 2 types of objects were believed to be able to resist flames unharmed: sacred artifacts and curses. The Vatican never confirmed owning such a parchment, and soon after Sister Antonella asked to examine it, her access privileges were taken away. No reason was given. Some whisper that the parchment contains a forgotten gospel, one that reveals a second agreement hidden from Rome. Others claim it tells of a time when Christ travelled to lands not recorded by the West, and some suspect it was never meant to be found. Even today, deep within the marble halls, the tomb tunnels remain untouched, and somewhere in the shadows, beyond the sealed chamber, a mystery might still rest. Written not in Latin or Greek, but in a language older than both. A message meant for someone who has not yet arrived. In the quiet calm of the Vatican gardens, hidden behind tangled ivy and weathered stone, stands a small abandoned chapel that no longer welcomes visitors. Almost no one knows it exists. It has no official name, no listing on public maps, and its entrance has been closed to believers for over a century. And yet, within its crumbling walls exists one of the strangest discoveries ever made on Vatican property. A surface painted entirely with signs that no one can understand. The chapel was first recorded in the late 18th century by a young archivist named Father Emilio Carrozza. He was cataloguing obscure religious buildings around St. Peter's Square when he found a faint sketch in the margin of an old designer's diary. The chapel was simply called Cappella dei Segni, the Chapel of Symbols. When Father Emilio found the site, he expected dust, cobwebs, and silence. He was not ready for what he saw inside. From floor to ceiling, the inner surface behind the altar was covered with signs that defied all known writing. Spirals, celestial bodies with uneven dots, strokes that twisted and split into root-like branches or waterways. There were no crucifixes, no halos, no human figures, only shapes. Some glowed faintly in the lamplight, as if made by a substance no longer available. Others remained barely visible until viewed from a sharp angle, showing layers beneath the coating. He quickly reported his discovery. Within 7 days, 2 scholars from the Pontifical Academy arrived. They stayed for 3 days and left without explanation. Father Emilio asked, but got nothing. Then the chapel was sealed, locked, and its access key filed away in the restricted collection. Father Emilio was transferred to a position in Milan. However, fascination has a strange way of echoing through the decades. In 1977, a Jesuit mathematician named Brother Raphael Ibarra found an old photograph of the surface in a discarded archive box. He put the symbols through a decryption technology he had developed to interpret Enochian writings. The technology failed not once, but repeatedly when it encountered a particular section of the surface. This wasn't random information. It followed patterns, but patterns not of characters or numbers. What disturbed him even more was a hand-drawn transparency he found folded behind the photograph. Someone had outlined sections of the surface and compared them to rock carvings found in the Ethiopian highlands near Lalibela. The match wasn't perfect, but it was similar enough to raise questions. Could it be that the symbols weren't meant to be understood at all? That they were meant to be felt, to be called upon? In 2003, a language expert visiting the Vatican with limited authorization claimed the surface pulsed faintly when she stood silently before it. Her findings were never made public, and the Vatican refused to comment. Some suspect the surface contains a lost language of heavenly beings. Others suspect it's a map, a warning, or an invitation for something yet to appear. And yet no one, not even the Vatican itself, can say for sure what the symbols represent. And perhaps that's how they prefer it to remain. It began with whispers, not from the clergy or councils, but from visions. During the winter of 1954, Pope Pius XII began to wake with strange phrases etched into his mind. They were not in Latin, not in Italian, not in a language he knew. At first, he dismissed them as unimportant, just bits from the fog of sleep. And yet, night after night, the phrases returned, clearer, more complete, spoken constantly in the same voice. Not a murmur, but a chant, deep and distant, like monks in a stone passageway. At first, he told no one. However, silence in the Vatican often speaks loudly in its absence. His private assistant noticed changes. The Pope lingered more often alone in the apostolic residence, staring out the window as if expecting something to emerge from the distance. He uttered phrases softly, phrases that belonged to no language familiar to Rome. Then came the letter. A monk from the Ethiopian highlands had sent it months earlier, and yet it had remained misfiled, unopened, until a Vatican clerk accidentally delivered it. The parchment was old, the ink almost invisible, and yet the writing was unmistakable. Ge'ez, the ancient ceremonial language of Ethiopia. As the Pope opened the letter, something awakened within him. A familiarity, a memory that wasn't his own. He could interpret it phrase by phrase, term by term, as if he had spoken it his entire life. And yet, how? No previous pope had learned Ge'ez. No instruction in Vatican institutions taught it, and yet he understood it. That night, the visions changed. Instead of just phrases, he began to see places, desert shrines carved from crimson stone, manuscripts that glowed in the dim light of a flame. A voice communicated, not with orders, but with a warning. Guard the volume, keep the lineage, do not let Rome ignore. The visions troubled him so deeply that he secretly called a delegation from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. No records were kept, no announcement followed. The meeting took place under St. Peter's Basilica, away from prying eyes. One of the Ethiopian clergy, an old man with cloudy eyes and a voice like stone, recited a chant in Ge'ez. When he finished, the Pope repeated it perfectly. No one spoke for a long time. The cleric finally nodded and presented the Pope with a small tied package. Inside was a piece of parchment said to be a copy of the Book of Enoch. Kept only in Ethiopia, it contained a prophecy that had never appeared in any European scripture. According to the prophecy, in time a Roman leader would have a vision in the language of the East, and when that happened, the forgotten line of David would be close to appearing. The Pope never publicly discussed the meeting. The visions stopped soon after. However, in the collections, kept under layers of permissions, there is a single handwritten note in the Pope's own hand. It does not belong to us, but to them. And yet, I understand every word. The bells of Vatican City rang softly that morning, not with joy, but with sadness. And yet no one gathered. No crowds pressed against the ancient iron barriers. No clergy formed the procession. No singer raised their voice. It was a funeral without attendees, a whispered burial in the dark. The person being laid to rest was neither a pope nor a high-ranking church official. His identity was Abba Lema, an Ethiopian scholar who had once walked the quiet halls of the Vatican Library like a ghost, barefoot, soft-spoken, and often mistaken for service staff. And yet, in the stone chambers of the collections, those who knew him called him the living manuscript, because his memory held passages that no book had preserved. And beyond that, he had an understanding that the Church didn't know how to categorize. He had arrived in Rome in the spring of 1929, not by invitation, but by an urgent letter written in Ge'ez, sealed with wax from a monastery that no longer existed on any map. The letter was not addressed to the Pope, but to the collections themselves. It simply said, "The bearer of the lineage is coming." For years, Lema had worked quietly, helping to interpret forgotten documents, some of which the Vatican insisted didn't exist. He never asked for payment. He never demanded lodging. And yet, monthly, he delivered pages to the collection's vault, interpretations of writings the Vatican had never acknowledged, including prophecies from the Book of Enoch and a missing part of the Kebra Nagast. Then, during the winter of 1942, in the darkest period of the war, he disappeared. No one noticed. For weeks, the world was busy with explosions and borders. It was the service staff who finally found him in the tomb tunnels beneath the Ethiopian college. He was laid on a stone platform, wrapped in a shroud, his hand resting on a sealed document that smelled of incense and charcoal. Official records stated he had died of natural causes. No crime, no controversy. And yet, what puzzled investigators was not how he died, but why. He had left a single sentence carved into the stone next to him, written in a language that Vatican linguists could not understand. Only years later, a young scholar realised the inscription wasn't a phrase. It was a calendar date, a future date. The funeral was held quietly. Only 2 guards walked with the coffin to a private grave marked not by a name, but by a symbol, a star inside a flame. No priest led the service. No incense was burned. And yet, just before the coffin was lowered, an envelope was placed on top. It held a scroll, a passage in Ge'ez, and below it the Latin meaning, "Those who protect in silence are not left alone. Their funeral is just the world's delay. Heaven is already celebrating." In the very back of the Vatican Library, past the golden ropes and velvet barriers, past the marble hallways shined by the steps of popes and followers, there's a room almost no one has seen. Its door has no label. The way in is through a secret spot most church leaders think is empty. Inside, the air feels older than dust. It smells of wax and forgotten time. On a stone stand under layers of clear and dark rests a book unlike any other. Its cover is broken but still together. The pages, sewn by hand with threads of what looks like cloth, glow softly when a flame's light hits them just right. It's not gold. It's something much older. Some say the ink was mixed with crushed jewels and liquid from a spring that no longer exists. Others think the words were carved by someone who never got old. The writing is in Ge'ez, a language older than Latin, older than Greek, and definitely older than any writing the Church has ever made. This is the Ethiopian Holy Scripture, and it stays. It has stayed through wars, through hunger, through popes who came and went like kingdoms. It has stayed through fires that burned other books, and through whispers of secrets meant to stay hidden. No one really knows when it got to the Vatican. Some say a dying Jesuit brought it. Others say it was hidden during World War II, sewn inside a bishop's robe. Whatever the truth, the Vatican has never shown it, never said it existed, never written it down in official papers. And yet, it's there. The story goes that the last person to read it aloud lost their voice for 7 days. Another person, a German scholar, ran from Rome the day after reading a part of it. He was never seen again. A third person, a young priest from the Ethiopian college, tried to copy a page by hand. When he finished, the ink disappeared before his eyes. What is in this writing that bothers the highest church leaders? Why is it kept guarded, unreadable, and silent? Some think the answer is in how it's made. The Ethiopian Holy Scripture has more books than the Roman Bible. Books of Enoch, of Jubilees, of wisdom, long thought of as myths. In its pages, heavenly beings don't whisper, they cry. Prophets don't just predict, they remember. And Christ in a vision doesn't go back to the sky, but comes out from the middle of Africa saying words the Vatican can't understand. No rule has ordered it to be removed. No pope has tried to burn it. And so it stays. For whom? No one knows. And yet, in the quiet of that room, some say you can hear the faintest sound, like a song coming from a place too deep for the stone to stop it. And somewhere, maybe in the dreams of a forgotten monk, the writing waits for someone brave enough to read it aloud. We appreciate you watching until the end. If any of these hidden chapters have made you feel something, made you wonder what's behind locked doors or forgotten truths, please share it with us in the comments. We read every message. And if you haven't already, make sure to click, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we uncover. Stay curious, keep thinking, and until next time, rest in peace and dream deeply.